A violent stalker, an affair, a bodyguard, and a televangelist. It could be a tagline of a blockbuster movie or the beginning of a joke, but nothing about this tale is make-believe or funny. This is the true story of the Coleman family and the ultimate evil which destroyed every good thing they had ever dreamed of. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kimbyrleigha. If you've never been here before, nice to finally meet you. And as usual, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for today. Today's sponsor is Blue Nile, and I can't wait to show you all the pretty and sparkly things they have to offer. I don't know if you've ever noticed my earrings before. I usually wear a lot of them, and sometimes I have really long dangly ones on. And then there are these, which are my diamond stud earrings, and they are staples in my earring collection. I actually wear them every day, and I have for many years. I never take them off unless I'm cleaning them, and they even have special backings on them that make them very secure. These used to belong to my paternal grandmother, and I always admired them as a child, and she left them behind for me when she passed away, and they mean so much to me. And since my daughter just finished elementary school, and she's finally getting her ears pierced this summer, I wanted to purchase some really pretty earrings that resemble these ones, but are of course in a price range that fits my budget and the quality that I'm looking for. Blue Nile is the place to find the perfect piece for you or anyone else, with a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Blue Nile has it all. Plus, you can easily filter by price, metal color, stone type, stone shape, and more, like earring backing. And I like the very secure guardian back earrings, especially for someone like my 11-year-old daughter. And I thought these would be perfect for Shyla. She would truly love them and cherish them, remembering the milestones she reached when they were gifted to her. Blue Nile has some of the highest quality standards in the industry and offers thousands of independently graded diamonds and fine jewelry at prices significantly below traditional retail. So I'm confident that I'm getting quality pieces. Blue Nile is the original online jeweler since 1999, and they have jewelry experts on hand 24/7. They're available by phone or chat to help you find the most memorable gift on every budget. So many milestones are coming up in my daughter's life, and even when it comes to friends and family, I'm always on the hunt for something special. Blue Nile has the perfect gift for anyone that will stand out and be remembered. Not to mention, if you're looking for an engagement or wedding ring, especially rings that you can customize, look no further. You can build your own ring on Blue Nile with all of your unique specifications. And if you're clueless about all things jewelry, especially when it comes to stones, Blue Nile has an education tab where you can easily learn everything from the popular 4 C's when it comes to diamonds, which are cut, color, clarity, and carat, or to simply find out someone's birthstone so you know exactly what to shop for. Right now, when you go to bluenile.com/Kimber and use the promo code Kimber, I'll put it up on the screen and I'll leave all of this info below for you in the description box. You'll get $50 off purchases of $500 or more, and there is just so much to choose from. I'm sure you're gonna find something you love. So for an unforgettable gift with timeless appeal, visit Blue Nile, and thank you so much to Blue Nile for making today's video possible. So before we get into this video, I just want to let you know, if you have not been here before and you're not used to a deep dive, this is an ultimate deep dive. This is the deep dives of deep dives. I am sure you can find this case elsewhere where they do not go into these details and they just kind of tell you what happened. That's not going to be this case. So if you have been waiting for a case to listen to while, I don't know, you're on a road trip or you're getting your house ready for July 4th or whatever the case may be, I know a lot of you have told me that you save my long videos for when you have things to do like that. This would be the video. It was so long that I actually had to record it in 2 sittings on 2 separate days, so I had to throw this whole outfit on again, try to look exactly the same. I don't know if you're going to be able to tell where the first part ends and the second one begins, but if you have an eye for that, put the timestamp and you might get something special from me. Also, don't forget, I am coming to Austin, Texas, August 25th through 27th for the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival. I will leave everything below. I would love to see you there. I'm also going to try to do a little meet and greet somewhere outside of the event, possibly like a restaurant, something like that. We shall see. I've never done this before. But right now, the best way to come hang out would be to go to the festival itself. Okay, now let's get into this video. Today, we are talking about another beautiful family, the Coleman family, consisting of husband and wife Sheri and Chris Coleman and their 2 young sons, Garrett and Gavin. But before I go into talking about them as a family, I'd like to introduce you to Sheri and Chris before they were married. Sheri Ann Weiss was born July 3rd, 1977 to high school sweethearts Angela DeSico and Dawn Weiss. She was their second child. They had a son, Mario, 2 years earlier, and they were excited that they would be growing up together. Angela and Dawn started dating when Angela was a sophomore and Dawn was a senior in high school. They were living in Berwyn, Illinois at the time, and Angela came from a big Italian family. She was one of 8, and Dawn was the youngest of 3 boys. They fell in love. Angela got pregnant just a few months later after meeting Dawn, and she wasn't even done with her second year of high school, but the young couple were determined to make it work. Dawn quickly got a job at a paint supply company where he was making under $5 an hour, but back then, it was pretty normal, and that wasn't bad pay at all. They believed that getting married was the right thing to do, so they tied the knot on September 7th, 1974. Mario was born 5 months later in February, and then Sheri came along thereafter. Over the next few years, Angela devoted her time to her kids, and Dawn worked hard to support their family, and eventually they moved to a township in a suburb of Chicago. They loved it there. Sheri and Mario went to Woodrow Wilson Elementary School, and Angela was on the PTA. She was very involved in her children's lives. They were always doing something, and she really didn't want them just sitting at home doing nothing, so she believed in being active. Sheri was part of Girl Scouts, and Mario was in the Boy Scouts. Both of them played instruments as well, Mario with the trumpet and Sheri on the drums, and they were also involved in sports. When Mario was just about to go into high school and Sheri was entering middle school, Dawn landed a job out in Largo, Florida. He'd be working at a data communications company, so the family had to pick up and move. And Angela was worried about the kids. She thought it would be hard for them to adapt, but the move ended up being a pretty smooth transition. But it was still a transition, and it was harder on Mario than Sheri, who was outgoing and seemed to make friends easily. Sheri was about 10, and Mario was 12. So it makes sense it would be easier for Sheri. On the other hand, Mario missed his friends. He wanted to be back home. He was a bit quieter and kept more to himself than his sister, but once Mario began classes at Largo High School, he found a best friend, and then they started doing everything together, and that really helped Florida feel like home to him. Meanwhile, Sheri was a different story, and once she got to high school, she really began to bloom as a person. She was on the cheerleading squad for Largo High School Packers football team, and just outgoing, a great softball player. And also something I found interesting is that she was actually ambidextrous, which meant she was very unique. She could throw with her right hand, but swing the bat with her left. And she had a lot of admirers as well. Boys, of course. She had these piercing green eyes, ones that I don't think I've ever witnessed in person in my entire life. They're just out of this world beautiful. She was petite, she had dark hair, olive skin, and she actually considered going into modeling. But Sheri was a tiny thing. She wasn't even 5 foot tall. Same for me. So that idea took a back seat. Besides, she had a lot to keep her busy as it was, like chasing down her favorite sports star, Michael Jordan. Her favorite basketball team back then was the Chicago Bulls from back in her home state, and MJ was her everything. She collected Bulls jerseys with the number 23 on them, which was Michael Jordan's number. She loved him, and as a matter of fact, maybe even idolized him. I don't know who else would drive 3 hours for a preseason game if they didn't, but Sheri did. It was back in 1994, and this is a time when Michael Jordan was trying out for baseball for a moment, and he had signed with the Birmingham Barons. Sheri brought him some flowers and told one of the people working at the event to deliver them to Michael. Well, she got the surprise of her life when he drove by in his Corvette and he stopped to personally thank her for the flowers. That was definitely a core memory being formed. If Sheri could get the attention of Michael Jordan, even for a mere thank you, I can only imagine how many heads she turned. But Sheri's focus wasn't on getting into a relationship with anyone. Her focus was on someone else's relationship. Her parents. They weren't doing well. Her father wanted a divorce. He and Angela were arguing all the time, and the environment was hard to be a part of, but Sheri had to push through. It was the summer before her senior year of high school. She was working as a waitress at a Thai restaurant and threw herself into her work and her friends. Sheri and her best friend at the time, Tara Lance, they would get away by watching Bulls games on TV, spending time tanning at the beach, and Tara and Sheri just clicked. Tara, just like Sheri, had moved to Florida when she was younger. She was originally from New Jersey. They were like sisters, and they kind of looked like they could be twins. They met in the drama club. Tara really wanted to be an actress, and Sheri was one of her biggest fans. They were inseparable that summer and into Sheri's senior year, when she would need more support than ever. It was finally happening. Her parents were separating. She needed all the support that she could get. Of course, she could still rely on Mario. He and her were very close. He would always protect his little sister and make sure that she was taken care of. As a matter of fact, he even bought Sheri her very first car. That's right, and that's actually a pretty big deal and funny too. He, being a couple years older, he started driving before her, and he was a really hard worker, always had a job doing something to make money. He eventually got a brand new 1992 Camaro, and once Sheri could drive, she would borrow sometimes. And that really annoyed her older brother because it was happening so often that he decided that he was going to purchase her a car, and he got her a 10-year-old Chrysler K car. Granted, it was a 1982 and not even $1,000. But for teenagers, like I said, that was kind of a big deal. It was very generous. And for Sheri only being 17, it was more than a nice gesture. It showed Mario's character and the way they were raised. You do things for others. And speaking of which, Sheri, just like her mother and brother, she was very caring. She was a good friend, always wanted other people to be happy. Some people called her a people pleaser. But as long as it isn't hurting you, I think it's perfectly fine to care about others and want to see them happy. Mario just wanted to make sure that no one was going to take advantage of his little sister. He would tell guys if they put their hands on his sister, there would be hell to pay. But Sheri proved she could take care of herself. After her parents got divorced, she needed time to heal. She blamed her father for breaking up their family, and she wasn't ready to forgive him. It was hard on Sheri. She felt bad for her mom, who was always unconditionally devoted to their family, and she couldn't believe their father would just walk out on her like that. It was not something Sheri could get over. So after she graduated in 1995, she threw herself back into work waitressing for the next few months until she found her calling, for the time being anyway. And it was quite a surprise to her family because Sheri was a girly girl. She was a cheerleader, as you know. But remember, she had this athletic side, and she thought there was something about throwing herself into a position that would take a lot of effort that might get her mind off of her personal life. That would do the trick. So she announced her family that she was going into the Air Force. Wow, I mean, that was quite a big decision. And Mario definitely wasn't a fan. He tried to change her mind. But something about Sheri that you'll find out, if you haven't already, is that when she sets her mind to do something or she wants something bad enough, there is no changing her mind. So off she went to Lackland Air Force Base back in September of 1986 in San Antonio, Texas, far away from home, surrounded by people and things she had never experienced before. It was an adventure, and it was about to get even more exciting. First, it was Angela and Mario watching her graduate from basic training. That was a huge accomplishment, and they were both very proud of her. It's not easy. It's grueling, actually. And Sheri's dad wanted to be there, but he wasn't invited. They were still not on good terms. And after basic training came and went, Sheri's new placement was at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia. Her job? Military police. Not just any kind, though. She was in the K-9 unit. Sheri undertook the task of a security officer doing rounds outside the base with her German Shepherd. She took her job very seriously. However, it was also something she really liked to do. And it would also be how she would ultimately meet the love of her life, Christopher Coleman. So I guess this would be the best time to introduce him to you. You know a lot about Sheri at this point. So now let me introduce you to her soulmate, who coincidentally is also originally from Illinois, like Sheri. He was born on March 20th, 1977, just 5 months before Sheri, in Percy, Illinois, to his parents Ron and Connie Coleman. Percy is close to St. Louis, about 5 hours south of where Sheri grew up, but far enough away, though in the same state of Illinois, for Chris and Sheri to have never crossed paths during their childhood. Chris's family had been in Percy a long time. His paternal grandparents settled there as coal miners back in the 1920s, and it made me think, Coleman, is that how they got their name somehow? Chris's paternal grandpa, Gene Coleman, he was the mayor of this city until the mid-70s. The family was well known, but the city was actually very small, so it wasn't hard to be a big fish in such a small pond. There were only about 1,000 people living in this area, and even today, it's about the same. The Coleman legacy was coal mining operations and civic service. Chris's father, Ron, was one of 6 children born to Gene and Doris Coleman, and they took pride in the family coal mining business and instilled a strong work ethic in their children. Ron was athletic, he was a great swimmer, and he excelled in cross-country running at Trico Senior High School. While he was a senior, something else got his attention. A very pretty young lady with stunning blue eyes named Connie Chope. She was waitressing at her family's restaurant when she caught the eye of Ron, who was a few years older than she was. But they hit it off, and started dating in 1968 when Ron was about to graduate. Soon, he was working in the coal mines just like his family had before. He did try to go to college at Southern Illinois University, but manual labor suited him better than sitting in a classroom. He waited until Connie graduated high school before making her his wife. That was December 10th, 1972 in Belleville, Illinois. Now, coal mining is not a glamorous job. I don't think you'd envision it as such if you've never seen the people who venture into these mines and the work that they do. It's more than grueling, especially back in the 70s when the technology was not as advanced as today. Not only is it physically demanding, it's dirty and it's dangerous. For one, it's a pretty toxic environment. You're working with substances known to cause cancer, you're breathing in dust from the coal, and there's also the chance that the entire mine can collapse. As much as Ron tried to remain loyal to his career path and his family business, he began to imagine that he was made for something more. But he remained a coal miner for a decade. During that time, he and Connie had 2 more sons, Brad and Keith. When Ron wasn't working the mines, he was a devoted husband and father. The family would attend church together and eventually found their way to a Methodist church in Belleville. It was about a 90-minute drive from Percy, but the community there was definitely worth the drive to them. It's where they would socialize, worship, and their children learned morals and Christian ideals, which became the center of the Colemans' lives. There isn't much to do in these small towns, so this is where they found their community. And of course, when you're surrounded by people with the same beliefs, you bond in many ways, but you also tend not to venture out beyond that group of people. And through this group of people, they found out about an even more niche religious group that was gathering for prayer meetings out in Chester, Illinois. Now, this was kind of interesting to me. This prayer group was formed when a few individuals from the local First Baptist Church in Chester grew bored of their worship services. They wanted something modern and more fun, something that would appeal to a younger crowd. And when I say younger, I'm still talking about late 20s into their 30s. And Ron and Connie were in their mid to late 30s. And this idea appealed to them. When they heard that there was this new group offering more non-traditional and exciting church services, they had to check it out. It was run by a military doctor named James Krieg and his wife Betty. Their small group met weekly for prayer. Among other things, they were known for what's called speaking in tongues and spontaneous prayer. And I want you to know something about me. I have always been fascinated with people and further their belief systems. My major in college was actually biblical studies, not because I was religious, but because I have always been intrigued with history and the way that religion impacts people and their lives. I eventually changed my major to psychology, but for anyone that isn't religious, I want to say that you don't need to be, and you can still be open to learning about the way others live and believe, because it can be quite interesting, and it can also help you understand some people better, because we're all so different, and that's okay. I don't agree with some of the belief systems that victims or people in my stories subscribe to, but I see them as people, and I respect and honor the way that they chose to live as I remember them. First, I want to go into speaking in tongues. If you haven't heard of this before, I'll let this clip speak for itself, literally.
In the name of Jesus, you be made whole by the power of God. Here
it is. Oh, that's real. This is real. This is real. This is real. That's it. That's it. That's it. That is a whole new level of breakthrough in your life tonight. A whole new level of breakthrough in your life tonight.
If you're wondering where in the world this originated, it was mentioned in the Bible in 1 Corinthians 14. It's known as a spiritual gift from God and the Holy Spirit to a believer who's baptized. And this language means nothing to anyone except God. So the things that are coming out of these people's mouths are something that only God would understand, because he's the one listening to the speaker, even though we can also hear it. Essentially, certain Christians believe that the Holy Spirit enters the body and speaks through the person as a vessel. And I'm no expert in this, but I'm always interested in learning what other people believe in. And I'd heard of speaking in tongues, but I wasn't familiar with spontaneous prayer at first, but it's exactly what it sounds like. And it's much more common now. But there are things such as set prayers and spontaneous prayers. But spontaneous prayer is not memorized, it's not read, it's guided by the Holy Spirit. It's more reactive. It comes from in the moment, like finding out a loved one is suffering from cancer or getting a prayer request from a friend. Well, the prayer group was doing this in the 80s, and it was a new way of prayer for many people who had grown up very regimented. It was like a breath of fresh air, and it truly enlightened Connie and Ron so much that they began to imagine running a group similar to Dr. Craig's group, but they needed experience. So Ron got his chance when the group of them grew out of the place they were in and needed a larger space. They pooled money together, and they rented out an old tavern called the Nighthawk. And I looked for information on this establishment and found a Facebook page called Chester, Illinois Through the Years. I searched it for Nighthawk, and voila, lots of locals telling stories about it, among other landmarks. Apparently the Nighthawk was the place to go for delicious pizza and after-hour drinks. It would stay open well past midnight, but unfortunately it got raided in 1973, and cops arrested many underage drinkers, so maybe that's why it was vacant when the Colemans began going there for their prayer meetings. This is what I absolutely love about my job. I love being part of someone's history. I feel like I'm eavesdropping. When I read hundreds of comments on this Facebook page, I feel like I'm there with them as they reminisce about growing up in a much different time than now. It's nostalgic, and I hope some of you feel the same way when you're watching my videos. It's what excites me about doing this. Well, the Nighthawk, it was once filled with late-night debauchery, but now is a place of worship. It was renovated as much as possible on a small budget so that it resembled more of a church and not a watering hole. The name change helped. Grace Bible Church. Now was Ron's chance to shine. Be the man he envisioned. More than a minor, he was the new part-time pastor of the church. The thing is, Ron did not have experience. Talk about spontaneous prayer. He was living on a prayer when he first began this journey. His sermons put people to sleep more than they filled them with hope, joy, and enlightenment. But he wasn't going to give up. He just needed a little inspiration, a role model, someone who came before him and knew how to be a successful preacher. And he turned to someone that he looked up to, someone that inspired him to be a better person. It was a preacher that felt like they were speaking right to you and only you, even when the sanctuary was full of hundreds of people. Her name was Joyce Meyer, and she becomes a very big part of this story. But of course, we'll get into that later. First, I have to tell you a little bit about who she was back in the 80s and why she was so inspirational to Ron and Connie. They would drive the family out to St. Louis to see her speak any chance they got. Joyce Meyer. Well, for one thing, she's a woman, and traditionally priests, pastors, preachers, they were men, so that set her apart first and foremost. But it was also her style that drew people in. She was someone who had a rough start in life. She overcame things like her own father being inappropriate with her sexually as a child, getting married young at only 18, and enduring heartache for 5 years due to her husband cheating, among other things. That marriage ended in divorce. And after that, she struggled with a drinking problem, which is what drove her to seek God. She said in an interview with Larry King, quote, "I had lots of hurt, lots of pain, lots of woundedness, bruises, brokenheartedness in my life," end quote. Then she talks about what her father did to her physically, mentally, and emotionally, saying, quote, "My mom didn't know what to do about it, and she was being hurt in the process. So she just didn't deal with it. And I can guarantee you, just because you don't deal with something, that doesn't make it go away," end quote. Joyce got pregnant when her marriage was falling apart. She said, quote, "Actually, he left me and lived with another woman while I was pregnant with that child." She named that child David after her brother. Then ultimately, when she was 24, she ended up marrying a man named David as well, Dave Meyer, an engineer draftsman who was a devoted Christian, and that changed her life. They are still married after 55 years together. While attending Our Savior's Lutheran Church in St. Louis, Joyce began leading a Bible study at a local cafeteria, and she was becoming very popular among local Christians, and just within a few years, she was offered a position as an associate pastor at Life Christian Center in Fenton, Illinois. And this is when she started to really shine. It was a charismatic Christian church, another sect of Christianity that I was not familiar with. It emphasizes the Holy Spirit and spiritual gifts that are given to believers. We talked about speaking in tongues. I looked on Wikipedia, and they also mention miracles, signs and wonders, and supernatural occurrences. And all of these things are expected to be present in the lives of true believers. This includes prophecy and healing, and I am sure you have seen at least one meme where someone's being healed by a preacher. Ones like this.
Glory to God. You're not bound to this chair. The day will come, you'll walk out of it. In the name of Jesus. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Now then, you guys just help him up. Help him up. The power of God's all over him. He's not hurt.
Yes, spiritual gifts. Joyce was one of us, one of the broken, someone who wasn't a perfect Christian, but grew into a devoted one to look up to. She said in the same interview with Larry King, quote, "I didn't have any knowledge. I didn't go to church. And I had a lot of problems, and I needed somebody to kind of help me along." And I think sometimes even people who want to serve God, if they have got so many problems that they don't think right, and they don't act right, and they don't behave right, they almost need somebody to take them by the hand and help guide them through the early years, end quote. And Joyce was someone who extended her hand to those in need, those who wanted to change. And soon, the church she was preaching at became one of the leading charismatic churches in the area because of her. She was even doing daily 15-minute radio broadcasts on a St. Louis radio station. And by 1985, Joyce decided to branch out on her own. She resigned from Life Christian Center, and she started her own ministry called Life in the Word. She was also so popular on the radio that 6 other radio stations picked up her show from Chicago to Kansas City. And this was around the time Ron was looking for inspiration to guide him in his own preachings at Grace Bible Church. At first, he was really green. He didn't have the most charismatic way about him, and he was encouraged to amp it up. He was also kind of cold and impersonal, but there was a sense about him. Not that he was better than anyone else, but he was confident, and that drew people in. You wanted to make him like you. And over time, Ron really grew into a very likable preacher. Eventually, Grace Bible Church grew out of the Nighthawk, and they built their own church. In April of 1994, the church offered Ron a full-time position as the pastor, and he accepted it. It didn't take long for Ron to be calling the shots at the church. He and Connie were a power couple. She had a big, bright, inviting smile, warm personality, and that kind of made up for Ron's standoffish persona. She was compassionate, kind, and of course, the pastor's wife. So she came with a package. She was part of Ron's success so much, they decided to take over the entire church. And they changed the name, and it became Grace Church Ministries, located at 2100 State Street in Chester, Illinois, where Ron and Connie became co-pastors. Now they were both preaching to their own congregation. And their boys, well, now they were pastors' sons, held to a higher standard, that's for sure, because when you're trying to influence a large group of people, you lead by example first. So the Colemans expected their children to be involved in their church. And they were, especially Chris. He was constantly at church events and activities, very well behaved, the firstborn, usually the overachiever in many ways. He definitely worked harder to maintain Christian morals, at least compared to his 2 younger brothers, who were known to be more carefree, even unruly. Chris was 17 when his parents took over as pastors, but through the years prior, he was always involved in church activities as his parents were building up their congregation. He went to St. John Lutheran School up until high school when he went to Chester High, which was close to the Grace Church. He played sports, including baseball, football, which his parents really pushed him to do. Since he wasn't interested in more, boyish activities like hunting with his father and brothers, he did not like killing animals. And that stuck out to his dad. It was pretty much the only thing that he saw as remotely negative about his son. He was incredibly reserved and emotional. His sensitivity wasn't seen as a good thing by his parents. They would try to encourage Chris to be tougher and even more masculine. And in an effort to toughen him up, his father took him on these regular hunting trips, even though he knew that Chris wasn't a fan. But finally, after an incident happened where Chris was disturbed when he was watching his dad gut an animal, they finally agreed that Chris should probably just stick to focusing on sports. But nonetheless, his mom Connie said that Chris was a joy as a child. He really embraced their beliefs. He would even speak in tongues, letting the Holy Spirit just compel him. Whereas Chris was very humble, his brothers were not. They kind of reveled in the popularity that their parents achieved. They carried themselves as holier than thou, but definitely didn't act holy. They were known to be bossy, arrogant, and almost trying to make a mockery of their family. They wouldn't even attempt to hide their sins. As teenagers, they would bring girls right to the church parking lot and make out with them. Forget Lover's Lane. They did it right there. Being a Coleman to Keith and Brad meant that they could get away with anything. Chris was the opposite, even though all 3 boys looked just like their father, Ron. Chris acted more like his father, especially when it came to Christianity. He was loyal. He set himself apart, but there was still something missing in him, and he thought he finally found it when a recruiter from the Marines came to Chester High School. This is how Chris and Sheri's lives collided. Chris was enthralled by the recruiter's presentation. He thought that this is what he was missing. Something challenging, being on his own, something he could do to prove he was manly, to prove to his father he was tough. So he enlisted right after he graduated. His career choice came as great relief to his parents. They believed he would finally become as masculine as they had wanted him to be all along. Chris, just like Sheri, was stationed at Quantico, Virginia in the K-9 unit, and that is where they met. From the moment they laid eyes on each other in May of 1997, it was love at first sight. Or maybe lust. But both of them knew there was something there. Sheri told her friend Jessica Wade that when she first saw Chris, she immediately knew, this is the guy I want to be with for the rest of my life. And they do say that sometimes you just know. If I had to guess, which I don't usually like to do, but I would think this is probably the first time Chris was really allowed to be on his own, to follow his own wants and desires, and independently make decisions away from his family, and that's what he did. Chris and Sheri started dating after meeting at that K-9 training seminar. Sheri was impressed by Chris. His determination, his grit, his loyalty to God. He was a good guy. He had many qualities that some women look for in a man. He checked off a lot of her boxes. Meanwhile, back home, Connie and Ron had been making quite a name for themselves, especially because of their association with Joyce. They started following her before she blew up and became who she is today. Before her empire grew into the multi-millions of dollars, she and the Colemans formed a friendship. She was someone that they looked to for advice, and the families maintained a friendship over the years as both their ministries grew. And both became successful in their own ways. Around the time that Chris went into the Marines, Joyce and her husband Dave created a television ministry. It was Dave's idea. Joyce had done so well on radio, he figured TV would be even more powerful, and he was right. This was how Joyce became known as a televangelist. Joyce still has a TV program till this day. It's called Enjoying Everyday Life, and I'm sure she was enjoying her life. In just a few years, she would be a best-selling author, flying in private jets, living in a $2 million home, driving exotic cars, and eventually having a $20 million headquarters in Fenton, Missouri. We will get to all of that in a moment, but Chris's parents were about to get a surprise visit from 20-year-old Chris and his new 19-year-old girlfriend that summer. They decided to leave the military. Sheri wanted to get out and explore the world, and being in the Air Force at the time gave her that opportunity to travel and have a lot of fun adventures along the way. And actually getting into a relationship and settling down was not part of her plan. But after meeting Chris, Sheri fell hard and fast, and all they wanted to do was be with one another and experience life. Chris and Sheri were the perfect example of opposites attracting, because Chris was shy and cautious, and Sheri was joyful and outgoing. Chris's religious upbringing also meant he was incredibly reserved when it came to things like showing affection publicly and verbally, whereas Sheri had no problem with giving people hugs, her family and friend kisses on the face when they're out in public. She was Italian, let's remember that. So her electrifying energy seemed to bring out another side of Chris. And in those early days, his friends noticed that when she was around, Chris was more relaxed. He was coming out of his shell. His whole life, he was in somewhat of a battle between his innate nature and his parents' expectations of him. This left him in a constant state of internal turmoil. Every decision he made, every action he took, became a delicate balance between who he truly was and who he believed he should be in his parents' eyes. But Chris was becoming more confident in his own choices, dating Sheri being one of them. He actually couldn't wait to introduce her to his family. He was in love. Sheri felt the same way, so they made a plan to visit Sheri's mom, Angela, and her brother, Mario, who were now living back in Chicago, Illinois. They'd go to Chester first to meet Connie and Ron, then make that 5.5-hour drive out to Chicago so Sheri could introduce Chris to her family. Sadly, Sheri was still not on speaking terms with her father. She had not been able to forgive him for tearing their family apart. Well, it seems like Chris's confidence just melted away as soon as he called his parents to let them know he was making a trip back home for the weekend. He never even mentioned bringing Sheri. He actually hadn't even told them he had a girlfriend. They were shocked to see a woman getting out of the passenger seat of Chris's car when he pulled into the driveway. Ron was peeking out through a window in the house when he heard the car pull up, and then he caught a glimpse of Sheri and he yelled to his wife, "He's got somebody with him." They hadn't seen their son in a while, and they were excited that he was making an appearance, but they were just very surprised that he brought a girl home. They definitely were not expecting that at all. And Chris could tell. He was used to his parents being judgmental, especially when it came to women, because no one seemed good enough for their golden boy. They tried to smile and pleasantly welcome Sheri into their home, but once she left, the disappointment was so obvious. I'll explain. To Sheri's face, the Colemans put on a show, one they were used to acting out at the pulpit, loving, accepting Christians devoted to God and treating others the way they want to be treated. But Connie wasn't impressed. To her, Sheri was just, in her own words, quote, a little blonde-headed worldly girl, end quote, whose shorts were too short, no matter how hot the weather was, and the tattoo that you could see from underneath those shorts was just too much. This wasn't the girl for their son. She held her tongue, as did Ron. Besides, Chris introduced Sheri as a good friend who was in the military with him and lived out in Chicago. He was just stopping by to say hi to his parents on his way to drop her off at her house. Wow. You can tell how Chris submits to his parents. It's like he just falls apart in their presence. Just like Sheri, he was a people pleaser, and though an adult now, his parents' opinion still mattered to him. The couple only stayed a little while before heading out to Chicago, and now it was Chris's turn to be put under the microscope. And it was Mario observing him. He and Sheri were raised in Chicago and Florida, two places that have a very distinct culture, and I can speak to that as a native Floridian. There's a lot of sarcasm, innocent teasing between friends, just basically giving each other a hard time. But when Mario tried this with Chris, it was like talking to a rock. He was just very socially awkward. And Mario wasn't sure what his outgoing and vivacious sister saw in such a boring guy. Truly, he was just as judgmental as the Colemans, calling Chris a hillbilly because he had a southern accent, and pulling Sheri aside to express his disappointment. He just kept pressing her about, what are you doing with this guy, Chris? And she was quick to tell him, we're in love, and we're gonna get married. And Mario was shocked. He totally understood love and how they may feel like they're in it right now, but they were so young. Couldn't they just wait a little while? Like, what is the rush? You've got your whole life ahead of you. Mario thought that they should just get to know each other or live together before making such a permanent decision. Sheri never gave Mario an answer. So even though he really didn't want to assume anything, he had to ask, are you pregnant or something? He just couldn't understand the rush into marriage. Sheri said no. They just wanted to be together forever. And 4 days later, they were. They secretly went downtown to the Civic Center and they got married. It was August 8th, 1997, when Sheri became Mrs. Sheri Ann Coleman. Chris was overcome with excitement. He couldn't hold back. He called his dad right from outside the Richard J. Daley Center, and when Ron answered, Chris told his dad that he was still in Chicago. Ron was like, is everything okay? And that's when Chris, who couldn't contain his excitement, shouted with joy, Dad, you'll never believe what we did. We got married. And it was crickets. It was like the line went dead. It was so quiet. This wasn't what Chris was expecting. But I'm like, you're shocked? He knows these people and their high expectations, not to mention the fact he didn't even admit that Sheri was his girlfriend. So saying he just got married to the good friend that he met in the military that he was just dropping off in Chicago would definitely be a big surprise to his parents. They didn't know what to think. Chris just sat there and he finally said, Dad, you don't seem excited. Ron replied, just give me a few minutes. There was so much that Chris and Sheri had planned the last few months, and now it was all coming together. Sure, they eloped, but they wanted a wedding reception. They just needed time to prepare. So by next summer, they planned to invite everyone they love to watch them exchange vows. But right now, they were focused on making Illinois their home again, back to their roots. And they decided it would be best to be close to Chris's parents in Chester. So they packed up everything and started driving there after delivering the happy news of their matrimony. It was a lot for the Colemans to take in, and moving to Chester would be a huge adjustment for someone like Sheri, who was definitely not used to living in such a small town. Remember, Sheri wanted to explore. She liked adventure. Well, this would be quite the adventure in one way, but probably not what she expected. She wasn't even a Christian. I cannot think of the clip, but there's this clip where this woman is saying, like, she's not a Christian, she's dark-sided. I'm going to put it here if I can find it.
Did you not ask if she believed in God? She's not a Christian! She's tampering in dark-sided stuff! She is dark-sided too!
This was basically what the whole town was like. It was based on religion, evangelical Christianity to be exact. And the Colemans, as pastors, people would expect their son to be married to someone like them. It was a reflection on their reputation as leaders in their church. So what were they going to do? Well, what they're known for, of course, preaching their beliefs to Sheri in hopes that they could convert her. That work had to start right away, and Connie gladly took on the role of spiritual guide as soon as Chris and his new bride moved into their home. Sheri was clueless when it came to religion. She did not practice it growing up. Sure, she was Catholic by default since her family was Italian, but she didn't do more than her first Holy Communion. But remember, Sheri was two things intertwined, almost a walking paradox. She was a people pleaser and strong-willed. She wanted Chris, and she was prepared to make everyone accept her no matter what she had to do. She had her mind set on being Chris's bride, and nothing was going to stand in her way. Besides, she valued family. She was still not over the fact that her own parents got divorced, so she found comfort in family values that the Colemans had, the closeness that they had, and she accepted Connie's willingness to teach her about the Bible and bring her to church. Besides, this was a good thing for Connie. It meant she could practice her craft. She saw Sheri as her newest little project. After all, Connie's job was saving the world one worldly person at a time. So bring it on. Connie would spend time teaching Sheri all about the Word of God, and it really didn't take long to convince her to be baptized and born again as an evangelical Christian. Even speaking in tongues, it was only a couple months before Sheri was doing it. But there was one big reason everyone was trying to make this work. Because as Ron put it, in his own words, quote, his son had messed around too early in life and wanted to make it right, end quote. Those were his words. In other words, Sheri was pregnant. She and Chris were keeping a secret. Sheri had lied to her brother when he asked if they were expecting a baby. That was the rush to get married after all. She was already a couple months pregnant when they came to visit. She didn't even tell her mom until a month later. When the Colemans found out, it was bittersweet. On one hand, a grandchild would be such a joy, but they hadn't gotten over the ungodly matrimony yet. Connie had come down on Chris for such a hasty decision. He told his mom he just got caught up in the moment, and her response was, well, it's a lifetime now. Even more so, bringing another human being into the world, and he'd be there before they knew it. Yes, they were having a baby boy. It was the beginning of 1998. Sheri's expected delivery date would be sometime in April. So before his arrival, the Colemans thought it would be a good idea to go meet Sheri's mom. They drove out to meet Angela in early April. It was pretty uneventful, except for Connie attempting to preach to Sheri's mom, telling Angela that being Catholic is against the Bible. Sometimes I'm like, the audacity to come in someone's home and do that. But remember, that's Connie's job. She doesn't know anything else. Garrett Dominic Eugene Coleman was born April 30th, 1998. His two middle names were in honor of his great-grandparents. Dominic was Sheri's granddad, and Eugene was Chris's. Garrett was a healthy, beautiful little baby boy, a joy to the family. Once he came along, any negativity seemed to disappear. It was all about that baby, especially for Sheri. The role of a mother suited her very well. Chris's parents settled into the fact that this was their reality. They were grandparents now, but first, they were Chris's parents, and they wanted to help him and his new family become independent, which meant Chris would need a job, since Sheri would be at home caring for Garrett. Put their feelers out to see if anyone in the community had work that fit Chris's skill set. A few months later, an opportunity was presented to Chris through his parents. They were at one of Joyce's conferences, and word got around that she was interested in hiring someone to help with a guard dog for her security detail. At this point in her career, Joyce had built an empire. She was making over $1 million a year, and it was steadily growing. She was the author of a number of very popular self-help books, cassette tapes, radio broadcasts, TV evangelism shows, live events. I mean, it was like she was a superstar. I almost liken it to being a famous singer. People would rush to buy tickets to see her preach in person. I found this video from what is called the Dominion Camp Meeting at World Harvest Church back in July of 1988. Now, I can't 100% say that this is the event that Ron and Connie went to, but it would stand to reason it was because it's held in Columbus, Ohio annually, and it's around the same time that fits the timeline of events. Now, Camp Meeting is an evangelical event in association with their communion season. It was a huge event, and if you were as devoted as the Colemans, you'd be there. I have to show you this video so you can feel the energy. You can see the production. what the atmosphere was like, here's a clip from the night Joyce Meyer led the meeting. This is the beginning of the service, and it starts out with a bang.
You see, I'm casting off my old man. For Jesus I now fight. I'm determined to do only what my God says is right. I serve notice on you, devil. I'm in this thing to win. And I'm raising up the standard of every kind of sin. Raise it up. Raise it up. Raise up the standard. Holiness, righteousness, and truth. I came to raise it up. Come on.
Wow, I mean, it's pretty exciting. The music, it gets you moving and inspires you. Even if you're a non-believer, the beat, the instruments, it's still somewhat powerful. So you can only imagine how electrifying this event would be for those who do vote their lives to this cause. Just look at the amount of people there. Definitely an interesting choice of party favor with the yellow crime scene tape being threaded through the crowd. I definitely did a double take, except upon further inspection, there says caution, party zone. It pretty much was a nonstop party, but there are serious moments, like Joyce's introduction. Here's that now.
I believe with all my heart that God sovereignly raised up Joyce Meyer. I just love it. I love it when God sits some down and raised some up. I'm thankful. I'm thankful for her ministry of feeding and feeding us and feeding us and making us. Oh, she's such a master at grabbing you by the nape of the neck and throwing you up in front of the mirror of the Word and refusing to allow you to do anything but see yourself reflected in its pages. I'm so honored that she has accepted our invitation and joined us at Dominion Camp meeting. I am honored by her presence, thankful for her ministry, and excited to introduce her to you. You know her well, Joyce Meyer.
Joyce coming to the stage, and listen carefully, and you can hear her speak in tongues.
We love you, Jesus. You're worthy to be praised. Amen. Oh, rabba-ba-shaka-ta.
What was that? Oh, raka shaka kaka? I don't know. But you heard that part, right? Here it is again.
Oh, rabba-ba-shaka-ta.
And here's her introduction. Her prophetic word was double. She definitely emphasizes this a few more times, and lots of speaking in tongues here.
And I've got a prophetic word for you in my heart. And when I say a word, I mean it's one word. This has come on me 4 times in about the last year and a half. This same thing. And God put it in my heart again for this place tonight. And I tell you, if you'll receive it, it's going to put you into a new realm. And here's the word. Double.
So double. Double what? Well, she tells you.
Double blessing, double prosperity, double health, double ministry, double church growth, double anointing.
But all I could think was double tithing, double donations. If you're going to get more, you're probably going to have to give more. At least she'll convince you to do so. Another thing I thought about is what Connie and Ron may have been hearing that night when Joyce spoke. One thing she emphasized was overcoming the challenges put in your life, because in her sermon, she shows places in the Bible where people who went through hardships were given double the blessings. That's the origin of the theme double in her speech. She goes on to say this.
Some of you had a rough time in your childhood. You've had some rough marriages. You've lost some jobs. You've lost some homes. You've lost some relationships. But my Bible tells me that when things don't go right in my life, if I'll stick with the principles of God, and if I will continue to do things the way God wants me to do them, no matter how I feel or what I think, and if I'll just keep it up and keep it up and keep it up and keep it up, the Bible tells me in Isaiah 61:7 that God will give me double honor for my former shame. Job had a lot of trouble, but the end of the book says that God gave him back twice as much.
You see how she talks about how she was just a housewife that was struggling, But what the world thought was trash, God was able to look at and say, I'm going to do something good with it.
And I'll tell you, Pastor Parsley's right when he said God has sovereignly raised me up, because I was just a broken down, old beat up, half nuts housewife in Fenton, Missouri that didn't even hardly know what direction I was going in. What the world would say is trash, God says, I'll take that and do something great with it.
I can't help but think that Connie and Ron may have felt that they were in quite a predicament with Chris and Sheri and now a new baby. Maybe they believed God would turn all of this around and bless them, that something good would come out of it. And it seemed like this was starting to come true with the opportunity that was presented. Who else would have the perfect skill set to train a guard dog but Chris? That was what his role was in the military, training canines. Connie and Ron told Joyce all about their son and his expertise. Joyce got in touch with Chris following the conference, and he came out to Fenton, Missouri, where Joyce worked and lived, to make sure her new guard dog could protect her from harm. She had security detail to keep her safe. Being as popular as she was came at a price. There were many people who were not fans of her work. Actually, I found many posts on Reddit, Christian blogs online, and even videos here on YouTube calling Joyce a false teacher of God's word, all highlighting times that she said things that went against the Bible and scripture, and there were things to back up these claims. Most of the people who called her out were Christians themselves, and they believed that she was doing more harm than good. There was this video from a YouTube channel called The Beat by Alan Parr. This video has close to 1 million views. It's entitled, Is Joyce Meyer a False Teacher? He goes over times when Joyce has gone against scripture. And you have to examine this under the umbrella of the world she lives and works in, the Christian world. Alan Parr, whose video I just showed you, he had a real-life encounter with Joyce and her preaching. He said that 20 years ago, back in the early 2000s, he attended one of her conferences, and back then, he didn't really know that much about scripture, but he said for the first hour, all Joyce did was show video testimonials from people saying that her teachings changed their life, and then she followed this up with asking people to donate money to her ministry. He did notice it, but he kind of just shrugged it off. But then she spent another hour or so before even getting into talking about scripture. She talked about speaking in tongues. And then she asked a large number of people in the audience who couldn't speak in tongues to come up one by one, and she would teach them. Because in her perspective, if you couldn't speak in tongues, you weren't truly living the Christian lifestyle. And of course, this made an impact. Well, by the time she was actually ready to finally preach, many people were tired. They were upset, according to Alan. He said people started to leave the stadium. Well, that's when Joyce stopped her sermon to condemn them, saying, if you don't want to be here, you can leave. It definitely left an impression on Alan. It appeared that Joyce seemingly wanted more and more money, and that was a big deal to a lot of people over the years.
Well, if everybody can settle down, I'm going to tell you about a few of the tapes I have out there, and then I'm going to go ahead and get into my message. Our tapes will only be here tonight, so if you want them, you got to get out there and get them tonight. A couple of books. So get that book on emotions, and then there might be at least 10 or 20 of you could use this book. It's called Me and My Big Mouth. This is probably my favorite album on my table. It's called Wilderness Mentalities. Here's a new album called Hold On, Help Is On the Way. And this is a new one that I'm real fond of. We just had this on television. To be honest, I was a little disappointed that we didn't sell more than what we did. I mean, the sales were good, but they weren't as good as some other things we put on, and I thought they'd just go off the top of the scale, but I got to get it through my thick head that not everybody wants to grow up. This is called Get a Grip and Face Reality. And then the last thing that I want to mention is, as you can see, this is a box. And we sell that whole package of tapes for, what is $110, Dave? And you know, some people go, $110? Well, what do you think it would cost you if you went out and got 1 hour counseling for your mind?
She's been publicly criticized for living an excessive lifestyle, but she didn't go around defending herself or her spending habits because, according to her, quote, there's no need for us to apologize for being blessed. Going on to add, quote, you can be a businessman here in St. Louis and people will think the more you have, the more wonderful it is. But if you're a preacher, then all of a sudden it becomes a problem, end quote. And it was a problem. So much so Joyce needed security wherever she went. And of course, at her compound, where she employed a number of people, hundreds of people. Chris was hired temporarily to make sure the guard dog was trained properly, but he made quite an impact on Joyce during that time, and she offered him a full-time position as part of her security team. This was huge, not only because the salary he'd receive was very lucrative, but because Joyce doesn't just hire anybody. Her ministry emphasizes supporting the mission to share Christ and love people. On the official job opening section on her website, it says that the ministry has 5 core values: love, faith, unity, excellence, and integrity. In other words, employees are expected to live a life worthy of God's approval, or at least the approval of Joyce Meyer's ministry. So it was an honor for Chris to have been chosen to be a part of Joyce's team. This also meant a move for Sheri, Chris, and little Garrett. The headquarters were in Fenton, Missouri, about an hour and a half away from Chester, but luckily, Joyce actually conveniently had a completely furnished home for Chris to rent. This seems so helpful, but it's also a little controversial. Your boss owning the place you live. If they own a lot of these properties in the same area, sometimes it's called a company town. Some see it as very controlling. Not to say that's what Joyce was doing. All I know is that the 3-bedroom home that Chris and Sheri rented was owned by the ministry. It was located only 16 minutes away from the headquarters in Afton, Missouri. And it wasn't in the best area. It had more of an urban feel to it, but that's something that Sheri was used to. She liked the city more than rural area. There was lots to do there, especially when she was a stay-at-home mom. Lots of fun places she could take Garrett, like parks, shopping districts. It was an exciting time for the new family, and it was about to get even more exciting because Sheri was expecting baby number 2. With a stable job and a new home, the timing was right. Little Gavin Christopher Coleman made his entrance on January 25th, 2000. His middle name, well, this time it was to honor his daddy, and he was the spitting image of his father. Both of the boys were. They looked just like him. They had big blue eyes and light hair. Now with 2 babies under the age of 3, it was a lot for Sheri, but she was more than ready to take on the task. She became the main caretaker of the boys, and Chris was very busy at work. He started in general security, but was hoping to rise up the ranks. He was always on top of his game, very serious about his career. After all, he was responsible for providing for a growing family. But it wouldn't be growing any larger because Chris underwent a vasectomy after the birth of his second son. For some reason, I was under the impression that that would be against God's will. I just assumed that you let whatever happens as a Christian person, but I don't have any details about how this was decided. It's a very personal decision. I'm sure he and his wife had many talks about what was best for their future, and it seemed like 2 kids was their maximum. And both parents spent as much time with their boys as they could. Chris had a lot on his plate. At the beginning of his career, he was really trying to work his way up. Being a part of Joyce's security detail was a huge undertaking. She had high expectations for her staff. Many people saw Chris as a militant perfectionist, but he didn't care what other people thought because he knew his goal was to prove he was worthy of an even higher position with more responsibilities, which equaled higher pay. Eventually, he was promoted to supervisor, increasing his wages, and of course, piling on more tasks. But then, the head of security left the company. This was Chris's chance to swoop in and prove his worth. It was the end of the year in 2000 when he applied for this position, and on his application he mentioned he worked in the military, he had experience in the Secret Service, among other things like working security for the President of the United States while he was in the Marines. There was a portion of the application that also asked about an applicant's spiritual life, and Chris explained that he and his wife had both become born-again evangelical Christians and that he began speaking in tongues, something we know Joyce is very big on, in 1986, and that Sheri started in 1997. I can't even believe you have to put that on your resume or your application. But remember, under the umbrella of where they lived and worked. He went on to say he didn't have any vices like smoking, drinking, or taking drugs, and he had quite an impressive resume. He was also well known to Joyce herself. She had known Chris since he was just a little boy. He used to accompany his parents to her prayer meetings. He was the perfect fit, and ultimately he landed the job. This new role increased his salary. Soon, they would be able to have their own home. But first, Chris needed to renovate his new surroundings at Joyce Meyer Ministries. It was time for an overhaul. He restructured the entire department from hiring military buddies and former police officers to getting rid of the old devices and systems that were being used and replacing them with state-of-the-art technology. He was in charge of everyone on the security team. He was calling the shots and very good at his job. His parents couldn't have been more proud. This new position meant Chris would have even more tasks. Being away from home was part of the job. Joyce traveled a lot. She did 13 conferences every year, including internationally. She would do speaking arrangements every month, book signings, public appearances. It was all very fast-paced. But Chris was determined to prove that she made the right decision when hiring him. His job was to make sure Joyce was protected at all costs. He set up new protocols with the help of police and security experts. He would fly out to locations prior to each event and make sure the local law enforcement agents knew that Joyce was coming. He would visit each venue beforehand, devise escape routes, private entrances, and the safest way for Joyce to preach, including crowd control, metal detectors, you name it. This is him at one of her book signings. You can see him in action. Chris didn't cut corners. He also had an air about him. You'd pretty much have to be like a macho persona, or at least act like you were tough if you were trying to basically protect a celebrity. So Chris could seem pretty standoffish to other people, especially employees working at the ministry. Some found him to be kind of cold. Remember, that's also how people described his father when his father started working as a pastor. But Chris had to remain confident. He was the front line of defense. He knew every single thing that went on around Joyce's compound. Nothing and no one could get past Chris. Therefore, he could be seen as somewhat of a pain in the butt, especially at events when fans wanted to meet Joyce. But they had to be vetted. Gone were the days you could just reach out and touch her and hug her and get into her personal space. It was just too risky. I also saw it like this. If anything were to happen to his boss, Chris would be out of a job. So I'm sure Chris had a passion for what he did that was deeper than that, but logically speaking, it makes sense. You want to protect this woman who provides so much for others. Speaking of which, after seeing the success Chris was having at Joyce's ministry, Sheri wanted to contribute. With Chris's pull in the company, he was able to help Sheri get a job too. She would assist in different departments where they needed extra roles fulfilled. But if you can recall Sheri's dream, it was to travel, to experience adventure. So she had her eyes set on Joyce's World Outreach Ministry. It's now called Hand of Hope. They help people all around the world, from anti-trafficking efforts, disaster relief, medical and dental care. This is missionary work, and Sheri began getting involved. She was even able to travel to India on one of these trips, and it was very fulfilling to her. She had a heart for those in need. But of course, she was needed at home with her two boys whose personalities were being formed. They were the best of friends and brothers, Garrett being more like his dad, kind of quiet, kind of in his head, daydreaming, and Gavin more like his mom, just a ball of energy. Ron called him a little pistol. He loved to laugh, dance, and entertain others. Just typical little boys being raised in a good family. Their grandparents were also really involved in their lives. Connie and Ron loved spending time with their grandsons. They brought so much joy to their lives, so perhaps Joyce was right. The hardships had turned into blessings, double blessings, with 2 bundles of joy to dote upon. They were also very well-mannered from a young age. Having Chris as a dad meant strict rules when he ran his household, kind of like he ran his security team. It was a tight ship. Everything had to be in order. The boys had to know when it was time to play and when it was time to behave and be serious. He was more of a disciplinarian than Sheri was. She was more the fun-loving parent that would let them get away with more. But Sheri and Chris were like the best of both worlds for their boys' upbringing. Some could call it good cop, bad cop, but they had both, carefree playtime and obedience training. By 2002, Sheri had reconnected with her father, finally. He was getting remarried to a woman named Deborah. It was tough at first, but perhaps Sheri's new religious outlook made her soften up. She even allowed Don and his new fiancé to visit her children that August for a little fun summer family weekend. Chris and Sheri took her dad and the boys and Deborah out to lunch, and then they went to the Science Center, followed by an evening at Chris and Sheri's home. On Sunday, Chris and Sheri took the boys to church, and then they met Deborah and Don afterward for some lunch. It was a really nice trip. And next to visit was Mario and a couple of Sheri's cousins. They treated Chris, Sheri, and the oldest son, Garrett, who was 5, to a fun afternoon at a Cardinals game. 2-year-old Gavin, he was with a babysitter that night, but he watched the game from home, so he felt like he was part of the fun, and everyone got along so well. The visits from Connie and Ron were more frequent. Almost every weekend, Sheri and Chris brought the boys to Chester to hang out with their grandparents. Sheri not being the girl for Chris was a thing of the past. They were very much in love and had a strong bond with their children. Everything was moving forward successfully, especially Chris's career. The bigger Joyce's ministry became, the more security she needed. The more popular she was, the more crazed fans that she drew in, the more security she needed. Because as much as she was loved, Joyce was also hated. By 2003, she was dubbed as what they call a prosperity preacher. This was not something she called herself, but the public did. We've heard how her sermons went. The testimonials followed by asking for donations. This was the year that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a special report on her finances. And I read it. She had a $10 million jet, a $2 million home, and houses for her 4 children that were estimated at $2 million each. a $20 million headquarters with around $6 million worth of furnishings, including expensive art pieces. The report included some more excessive purchases if the ones I mentioned didn't sound excessive enough for you, like a $23,000 marble toilet to sit your holy tush down on, $14,000 bookcases. I guess all those Bibles need a place worthy of their glory to hold them. And also a $7,000 eagle sculpture, just to name a few. I'm sure there were many more than the ones that were documented, but these are the ones I found in Wikipedia. Because of this report that came out, though, a nonprofit watchdog company called Ministry Watch actually reached out to the IRS, and they requested that they investigate Joyce Meyer and her family. It was uncovered her ministry was making a whopping $95 million a year and growing. So some people pegged her as a con artist who swindled weak people out of their life savings. Other people worshipped and defended her. But this was bad publicity for Joyce, showing all that prosperity when so many other people are suffering. It just wasn't a good look. Her ministry was a non-profit. So during this probe, investigators went to see firsthand what Joyce said at her conferences, and sure enough, she was literally telling the crowd, "You smell million, M-I-L-L-I-O-N."
Believe it or not, good preachers are not just out to get your money. The people talk to you about money everywhere you go, and the only place you get mad about it's in church. We ate at one of your nice restaurants today, and they brought us the bill. All we ask you to do is give something to help somebody else. Why is it that people will pay $60 and $75 to go to a concert, not think a thing about it, but when somebody's giving you life-changing word, well, they're just out to get your money. There they go, talking about money again.
And even asking for $7 million from the crowd, saying something like, "It would really bless me." What? I'm afraid to ask somebody for $1, let alone $1 million or millions. But she would preach, "If you stay in your faith, then you will get paid." And she told an audience in Detroit once, "I am now living in my reward." I pulled up the article that was written by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, like I told you, back in 2003, and it mentioned Joyce defending her purchases. For example, she said this private jet was a lifesaver for them and her family because, quote, "It enabled us at our age to travel literally all over the world and preach the gospel with better security than commercial flights." And that's where Chris comes in. Joyce went on to say that security is important and that she has received death threats and that she has a department dedicated to her safety, that the security guards are armed with guns, they patrol the front gate of her headquarters, making sure anyone that isn't invited stays out. Now, interestingly, I read this part which said that the ministry bought a $145,000 house where the chief of security lives rent-free to keep him close to the ministry headquarters. This was written in 2003. Chris was the head of security, so I thought, wait a minute, I thought he was paying rent. Maybe he wasn't. But by 2004, Chris got another raise and was making about $80,000, and the family was finally able to afford to move out of the home that Joyce Meyer's ministry owned and into their own house. That way they could finally set some roots down. They chose to go back to Illinois, Columbia to be exact. They purchased a 2-story, 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath home at 2854 Robert Drive. This was in the Columbia Lakes neighborhood. It had a big backyard with a deck, fireplace in the living room. It's just really sweet for this family to have a place like this. They finally get to make somewhere their permanent home, somewhere they can make friends. Their kids can make friends. And it wasn't too far from Chris's parents, only about an hour from Chester. And Sheri's mom and brother in Chicago, that was only a 4-hour drive, but at least they were in the same state. As per usual, I wanted to see pictures of the house, but I don't know why they're such bad quality since they were on Realtor.com, but here they are. I'm also going to show you what it looks like on Google Maps, but here's what the Realtor page had. Inside the living room was a brick fireplace. Here's the kitchen area, a dinette, and then you look through the sliding glass doors out to the back deck, and you can see the lake, and that's really pretty. They have a dining room, a jacuzzi tub in the main upstairs bathroom off of the main bedroom, even a cute little den area in the basement. It seems like the perfect home for the Colemans. It's also in a more upscale neighborhood. Here's Google Maps. Very nice home. And their house is one of the bigger ones on the block, if not the biggest. And here is the Columbia Lakes neighborhood from a bird's eye view. Columbia is a smallish town, definitely close-knit, great schools. It's just across the Jefferson Barracks Bridge into Missouri, where Chris works with Joyce. While Chris is at work, Sheri is getting to know their neighbors. There are lots of families in this area with young children, just like the Colemans. One of the first residents to welcome Sheri, Chris, and the boys into their new neighborhood was little Brandon Rigorex. His mom, Vanessa, and her fiancé, who were both in their late 20s, had a house just up the road. And once Brandon, who was only 5 at the time, saw the Colemans unloading and moving in, he was excited to play with Gavin, who was 3, and Garrett, who was 6. Vanessa escorted her son over to the new neighbor's home. She could hear the giggles and the voices coming from the backyard where the Colemans put up a trampoline. She saw Sheri and the boys jumping around. That's when Vanessa met Sheri and introduced their boys to one another, and it didn't take long for the pair to become best friends. It was great. Their boys played so nicely together, and the two of them could hang out, talk, and support each other, and that they did. When they weren't having girl time, shopping, or taking the boys somewhere to play, they would be there for one another. Vanessa needed some extra help once because she was hospitalized for a few days, and Sheri came to the rescue, making sure that Vanessa's family was taken care of, because that's who Sheri was. She walked the walk. And it may have been because she was alone and had a lot of extra time, because Chris was now required to travel a lot with Joyce. Sometimes he would be gone for up to 2 weeks, especially when they had an international event. But anytime he was back, he was in full-on dad mode. He would even take little Brandon and the boys out to do fun things together, like go see a movie, and even drop them off and pick them up from school. And not only that, Chris was very hands-on, but also handy and helpful. He would lend a hand to neighbors. If they needed something fixed, he was their guy. If you needed decorations hung up for the holidays, Chris would do it. The Colemans were a joy to have in the Columbia Lakes neighborhood. Everyone loved them. Vanessa thought of them as wonderful parents and saw Chris as a lovely husband, a good father, and close friend to others. And she was there for them too. She watched the boys when Sheri went on her missions trips. They trusted one another. And Sheri was able to make a lot of close friends very easily. And she kept in touch with old friends as well. Tara Lentz, remember her from the high school days? Well, with the dawn of social media, Sheri spent time on sites like MySpace where she would keep up with her old friends, and Tara and her would talk on the phone all the time. She lived in Tampa, Florida. She had been married but then divorced. So she was living a very different life, but Sheri was there to listen to Tara, who was all on her own trying to make ends meet, getting odd jobs here and there, even working at a strip club at one point and a cocktail waitress. But Sheri was always there to be non-judgmental and to encourage Tara, even inviting her up to their home to spend time with her. One of Sheri's goals was definitely trying to guide Tara towards religion, to get her to turn from her worldly lifestyle and give her life to God. Tara didn't really seem ready for that, but she would listen when Sheri spoke, and they remained close friends. That's just who Sheri was. She truly cared about others, and she kept in touch as much as she could, no matter how different their lives were. And Tara was very grateful for that. Besides, where Chris and Sheri were opposites, Tara and Sheri couldn't be more similar. They had the same outgoing personalities, infectious smiles, and the same desire for adventure. They even looked similar. It was only when Sheri found out she was pregnant and decided to settle down that their lives went on different paths. While Sheri was in full-blown mom mode, Tara was still trying to figure things out in her life, and that's okay. Not everyone is on the same timeline. But Sheri wasn't just going to abandon her friend just because they're on separate paths. Tara even attended birthdays and holiday celebrations with Sheri and Chris, and the family even took their boys out to Florida and visited Tara when they took a trip to Disney. Besides, as the years passed, Tara told Sheri that she was done with all the partying and the late nights, and that she wanted a family for herself, just like what Sheri and Chris had. Sheri was caring. She made it her mission to try to do what she could to be there for her friends and to be a good role model. Another woman that became a really good friend to her was Megan Turnbow. She actually worked for Joyce Meyer and hired Sheri as an assistant, something she could do when the boys were at school. And Sheri and Megan started as colleagues, but it wasn't long before Sheri's charm transformed their relationship into a strong friendship. It was great because Megan's husband, Lonnie, also worked for Joyce Meyer Ministries and was friends with Chris. So the four of them would hang out, they would have dinner together, and it was fine if the boys came too because they were so well behaved. Some people could not believe it. I guess, like I said, being head of security and former military paid off because Chris seemed to know how to get his boys to obey him and be very respectful. It could have also been the influence God had on their lives. Sheri was very devoted to her faith, and it showed. She would participate in daily prayer groups, reach out to friends and family back home to encourage them to convert, and was always at church. She was committed to spreading the word any chance she got, especially when it came to her boys. They were involved in church events like the youth group, learning all about God. They were also surrounded by other people and kids that were of the same beliefs. Another woman that was working for Joyce Myers became very close. Her name was Kathy LaPlante. Her and her husband, Bob, who was a pastor at an inner city church that was owned by Joyce Meyer, they had 4 kids, 3 boys and a girl, and they lived in a big house with a huge backyard, perfect for playing. Sheri would drop the boys off on a regular basis, and they would all play together. It was great because Aaron and Audrey LaPlante, they were the LaPlante's older teen children, they could babysit the younger kids. And the younger kids, Austin and Alex, were close in age to Garrett and Gavin. Bob's kids loved Chris. They thought he was so cool. With his shaved head and his sunglasses, they actually thought he was a part of the Secret Service. The Colemans were thriving. By 2006, Sheri had began to attend a new church in the St. Louis area. It was called Destiny Church. And by 2007, she actually left her job with Joyce Meyer Ministries and was working at Destiny Church as an assistant to the pastor, Phil Stern. Kathy, as one of Sheri's closest friends, began attending with her on Saturdays with Gavin and Garrett and Kathy's younger kids. The more she hung out with Kathy, the closer they got. They were like sisters. She would confide in her all the time about anything, from her own sadness, from her parents' divorce, to not loving the fact that Chris was gone so much. Even though by this time he was making somewhere near 6 figures, she was very grateful for that, but she just wished Chris could be home more. She missed him. She even mentioned talking to Chris about possibly starting his own security company and resigning from Joyce's company. And then there were Chris's parents, who of course accepted Sheri, but never seemed to really embrace her as a person and truly love her. There's just always seemed to be this distance between them. She went so far as to tell Kathy that she had heard gossip that Chris's parents actually believed that she got pregnant on purpose to trap their son. Instead of them becoming closer with her, it was the opposite. They seemed more and more detached. No matter how much effort she put in, and she did put effort in, she was always driving to Chester with the boys, attending family events, going all the way to Chester every Wednesday to attend their church services and watch Ron preach. Members of the congregation really liked Sheri. They found her to be kind, outgoing, a gentle person, and a true believer, but it was Connie who just seemed to genuinely dislike her. And that's really sad, and I've been there. It's hard because you want so badly to please these people who are close to your partner, their parents, but Connie would actually talk badly about Sheri behind her back to other church members, and it would get around. She even called her disgusting once, albeit it wasn't the beginning of their relationship, but it was merely because she enjoyed cheerleading. And it still hurt Sheri hearing those rumors years later. It seemed like Connie and Ron still held a grudge against her for getting pregnant before marriage, even though it literally takes 2, their son included, and most importantly, to make something like that happen, right? But he seemed to do no wrong. Maybe it was because they couldn't really control Sheri. She would abide by the rules to an extent, but remember, she was also very strong-willed. Ron and Connie, as heads of the church, were used to people bending at their commands and sucking up to them. But Sheri had her limits. Over the years, Ron had actually become more aggressive in his teachings at the church. Sometimes he was even accused of yelling at his congregation and having a God complex. It was like his way or the highway. He'd even tell people if they didn't like the way he preached, they could leave. And he'd point to the door. Even threatened them, saying that they weren't going to heaven if they didn't stay at his church, because it was the only one that was truly in alignment with God. It was a very cult-like mentality, even ostracizing individuals completely if they decided to go somewhere else. I mean, he would tell people to cut them off as friends, not to talk to them. And that's really sad. So many people stayed out of fear, not because they liked Ron and Connie. Not to mention how they felt elite, because their son was now in such a powerful position with Joyce. They had more than a son with an inside job. He had insider info, and whether he truly told them things about Joyce or they were just making them up and pretending Chris did, they acted like they had the scoop on everything, from like where she spent her money to personal issues she was facing aside from her work. Chris was closer to Joyce than ever before because she had now chosen him to be her personal bodyguard. Yes, indeed. He would go everywhere. Even literally when she needed to try on clothes at the mall, he'd be right outside the dressing room, privy to everything down to the size of her bras and panties. It was almost like he was a personal assistant more than a security guard. And Chris admitted to a few friends that he didn't really think she needed much protection in places like the mall, for example, but that she wanted that air about her, that she was important. And he was getting paid, so he didn't mind at all. Easy peasy. Even his role was somewhat of a facade. He would joke around that it was all about looking the part more than anything. That appearing intimidating was pretty much all it took. and Chris had gotten into this role. He was working out. He put on like 30 pounds of muscle after getting hired on the security team. He definitely looked the part, spending many hours in the gym to maintain that look. Some say he was even doing steroids, but I can't confirm. Sheri definitely didn't mind that, but she really wanted to just spend more time with him. Totally understandable. She has 2 young boys, and she wanted some time to undertake her own goals. She had been very inspired to become a medical technician after going on mission trips, so she was eager to free up some time to take classes. Chris understood this, and he tried to come up with a plan to even leave Joyce's ministry, possibly start a company of his own or even a gym. He also really desired more time to himself and his family, but Joyce just kept presenting him with offers he couldn't refuse. She gave him another raise at the beginning of 2008. Now he was making well over $100,000. It was just so hard to turn down. It was a very secure job with a lot of perks, and his family needed him if they wanted to maintain their lifestyle. The boys who attended Park View Elementary School were very active. Gavin definitely made his mark wherever he went. He was always laughing and smiling and dancing, so much so Sheri actually put him in hip-hop classes when he was 6. By 2008, Garrett was 10 and Gavin was 8, and he had taken up baseball, and Garrett's favorite was football. Sheri never missed a game, and Chris would come to every single one that he could go to if he didn't have work or other obligations. Chris made it a point to be a present father, one who would read his boys' bedtime stories, say prayers with them every night before bed when he was in town. July 4th weekend was coming up. That was the year 2008. Chris, Sheri, and the boys went to the LaPlante to celebrate, and it was a lot of fun. They had a barbecue together, they hung out, they shared chit-chats. Sheri seemed even more excited than usual. Why? She told Kathy that Chris had finally done the planning to start his own company. With all the experience he had, he could now open his own security firm, and they would handle jobs for all kinds of people like Joyce and other high-profile individuals. Having Joyce's ministry on his resume would put him in high demand. He would hire a whole team and eventually have more time by being able to relinquish some of his duties to others, and Kathy was so happy for them. But there was something else to be happy about. Chris and Sheri's 10-year wedding anniversary was coming up, August 8th to be exact. They were so excited to spend time together, and Chris wanted to make it memorable. He had some secret plans to renew their wedding vows. A church picked out and everything. So he went to Joyce's son, David, who was in charge of schedule changes and whatnot. And Chris requested time off and wanted to start planning for someone else on the team to accompany Joyce to Ethiopia on her next trip. Kind of get them up to speed before September came around, because he planned to take a trip with Sheri. And it would take planning as well. It would be too hard to juggle planning Joyce's international trip and the wedding anniversary. One had to take precedence, and of course, his family came first. But to his surprise and dismay, David Meyer refused to give him time off. Chris had been such a faithful servant to Joyce all of these years, almost a decade. So he was taken aback. He was shocked. He didn't know what to do. He knew Sheri would be crushed. So he asked David, at the very least, could Chris just step away on the day of their anniversary so he could just spend a little time with Sheri? And again, in utter disbelief, David said no. Why? Well, he said there was no one to take Chris's place. No one could protect his mother the way Chris could. That was an issue. If Chris couldn't ever step away, how is that a life? There has to be a balance, which is exactly why he was entertaining the plan to have his own company. The fact he wasn't even able to use his vacation time that he earned really upset Chris, which made him confide in close friends about the not-so-glamorous parts of working for Joyce. That's what happens. When you don't respect your employees, they turn against you. Now he would have to figure something else out. Something way smaller and less extravagant to do with Sheri. It was not ideal. She had sacrificed so much time with Chris over the years as he worked his way up with Joyce. And his poor boys, they missed him so much. One year, Chris was gone an estimated 260 days out of the year. And poor Gavin and Garrett, they would keep track of when their daddy would be home again. It made me sad because they had this little calendar on the refrigerator, and they would mark off every single day that Chris was gone and when they expected him to be back. And it was just truly so tough on them. They would check it every day until their daddy came home. Chris told his friends Joyce would do really disrespectful things, like make him sleep on the floor when they overbook flights, and that she was rude and demanding. She would sometimes actually throw empty water bottles at him when he was sleeping so that he would get up and fetch her a new one. Not to mention that all the mundane tasks unrelated to his job that Joyce expected him to do. It was like he was taken advantage of and doing a lot of things an assistant would do, like carry luggage, shovel snow in her driveway. things that were not security related. Granted, he was getting paid well, but not for all the extra work and not for no time off. That seemed like the last straw. Chris went so far as to tell Vanessa's fiance, also named Chris, that he thought Joyce's ministry was a scam. Clearly, she struck a nerve with Chris. He felt unappreciated. But at the end of the day, he was very grateful for having a job, especially one that could afford Sheri and the boys nice things. He had no choice but to keep working for her. And his job was truly important. You can imagine if this is the way that an employee speaks about Joyce, outsiders would be even harsher. She would receive hate mail, rude emails, death threats all the time, and Chris had to wade through them, making sure none of them would turn into a real-life problem. It's kind of like Joyce better treat him right, because if she wants to continue to be protected, you'd think you'd be kind to him. But Chris tried to make the best of it all. Perhaps the family could meet him in Florida for a trip to Disney. He had another trip with Joyce that was coming up in November 2008. It was a 3-day conference in Tampa, and Sheri would be happy to see Tara again. So August comes around. This is when they were supposed to be celebrating their anniversary. But in light of the fact that Chris and Sheri wouldn't be able to celebrate the way that they wanted, Sheri made plans with Vanessa. They had a little girls' trip to Chicago, and it was perfect because Gavin and Garrett were at summer camp at their grandparents' church, and Vanessa's son was with his dad that weekend. The ladies had become very close over the years, and it was exciting to get away for the weekend. Shopping, drinks, good food and fun, just the two of them. Sheri introduced Vanessa to her mom and her brother, and then they hit the town together. Sheri wasn't completely over the fact that Chris's job wouldn't allow him to get away for their anniversary. She confided in Vanessa about how Chris was so consumed with work that he'd even forgotten to make a reservation for her and Vanessa at a hotel that weekend. She told Vanessa that he said he would take care of it, but he never did. And it was moments like that that Sheri just questioned what was important to Chris and whether Sheri wanted to go on like this. Yes, it was a minor thing in the grand scheme of things, but it seemed like Sheri was second to Joyce. She tried to fill her time with the boys, with friends, with mission trips, shopping, activities with other families, and her faith. And that October, she had an opportunity to make a difference in one of her best friends' lives. The trip to Tampa with her family during Joyce's conference in November. Well, that wasn't going to work out as planned, but she told Tara, guess what? It would be really great if you had some time to catch Joyce's sermon, because she was sure it would be life-changing for Tara and bring them even closer. Now, Sheri didn't do this in a pushy way. It was more of an exciting tone, telling her friend, you know what? Joyce is finally going to be in your town. The highly anticipated and frequently talked about Joyce Meyer, who had been responsible for so many life changes from Chris's parents to Sheri and Chris themselves. And the conference started on November 6th. And since Chris was an employee, he could get her a discounted rate, maybe even get it comped. The idea that her best friend may become enlightened enough to accept God and become a Christian, that would be very fulfilling for Sheri, something that would bring her joy. So she was over the moon when Tara accepted the invitation. Tara knew it was definitely time to make a change in her life. She wasn't so sure about it at first, but after some gentle encouragement from Sheri, she did book the tickets in hopes that she would discover more about who she was and how to get what she wanted from life. Sheri was hoping that she and the boys could meet up with Chris after the conference was over and spend some time in Disney World. But what Sheri didn't know is that Chris's job was about to get even harder and more serious. All of their plans came crashing down as the Tampa conference was wrapping up. Chris was supposed to have time off afterward, a couple weeks, but something happened, and it was something he couldn't ignore. It was the night of Friday, November 14th, when Joyce Meyer opened her computer to find a very disturbing message. She had seen plenty of them before, but this one seemed more ominous. It had been sent to her husband David, as well as their adult children, David and Daniel, who were involved in her ministry. Chris routinely scanned Joyce's inbox, and he had opened his own that night and was actually shocked to find that he had received the same message to his work-related inbox, and it caught his eye more than any of the previous threats, because the subject line is what he noticed first. It read, F Chris. The whole word, though. I'm going to say F, but it had the whole 4-letter F word. And it went on to read, F Chris's family, they're dead. What he saw next was where the email was coming from. An email address called destroychris@gmail.com. What in the world was this about? Yes, Joyce had gotten plenty of threats over the years, but now Chris was being targeted. That was terrifying. Here's what the email said. And I'm going to put it up on the screen. It is a piece of evidence, so it does have some redacted sections. But here goes. You can see the date and time. It's around 8:36 p.m., November 14th, and that Joyce is CC'd among others. It said, quote, I am sure this will make it to someone in the company. If you jackasses are like any other company, this will be someone's account. Pass this on to Chris. And then there's 3 exclamation marks after that. The next paragraph says, quote, tell Joyce to stop preaching the bullshit or Chris's family will die. If I can't get to Joyce, then I will get to someone close to her. And if I can't get to him, then I will kill his wife and kids. I know Joyce's schedule, so then I know Chris's schedule. If Joyce doesn't quit preaching the bullshit, they will die during the Houston conference. I will kill them all as they sleep. If I don't hit there, then I will kill them during the book tour or the trip to India. I know where he lives, and I know they're alone. End quote. Wow. Now this next part is redacted, but I'm pretty sure it's the F word, like F them all, and they will die soon. It says, quote, tell that mother effer next time to let me talk to Joyce. She needs to hear what I have to say, and now she will, end quote. Wow, I told you that there are some fanatics that do not like Joyce, and they want to get close to her, and this isn't new to Chris or Joyce. But the concern was how Chris's family was now being targeted. Of course, they're going to take that seriously. Who wouldn't? Chris was the first line of defense protecting Joyce from crazed fans and haters, and now it looks like he's paying the price. That wasn't the only message. Chris got an additional one sent to only him just minutes after the first one. The subject line was, go to hell. The body of the email just said, quote, your family is done, end quote. Minutes after that, yet another message is sent to Chris's work email address. All from the same email account, destroychris@gmail. This next one said, quote, they will be done while you're gone at the Houston conference. I know you'll be out of town, end quote. Following that message, another was sent to Joyce's son, Daniel, with a subject line reading, Houston, death. Once opened, it said, quote, tell Chris his family's dead. I know his schedule, and they will die. Next time that mother effer will let me talk to Joyce, end quote. This is insane. This person seems unhinged, but it doesn't come as a surprise to me after everything I've read online about how some people feel about Joyce's ministry. Oh, and that wasn't the last email either. These were sent like one after the other after the rapid fire. Yet another to Daniel, again saying to tell Chris his family is dead, that they don't deserve to live with someone that protects the son of a bitch, Joyce. That was sent to Joyce's son, and it caused quite a stir, to say the least. But of course, the team kept it between themselves, trying to figure out what to do next. It's the weekend. Chris definitely doesn't usually share work-related threats and situations with Sheri, but because this concerned her and their kids, he let her know what was going on, especially because into Saturday evening, more messages were coming in. He sat Sheri down and let her know that someone was putting out threats on their lives. The additional messages that came through said, quote, and be prepared for a lot of F-bombs. Of course, I'm going to say F instead of the whole word, but it said F you in the subject line. And then it went on to say, quote, I know you all got my effing email. You think I'm full of shit. Just wait. I will shoot their asses with my 40. Kill them all. I'm so sick of bitches like her taking everyone's cash so she can fly her jet and pamper her white ass. F you all. Tell Chris I will kill them. He has no idea when, but it will happen. I'm sure you mother effers are going to try putting your beep, beep security team at the house or police, whatever. I'll kill them, then I'm coming after Chris, then you, Danny, then David. I might not be able to get to Joyce, but I'll get the rest of you mother effers. F you all. I know when you read this, just wait. You will see. F you all. Tell that bitch Joyce to give my money back and talk to me, and this will stop. Until then, everyone will die, starting with Chris, his wife, and kids. I know his effing schedule. Every time Joyce is gone, he's gone. You mother effers are probably wondering how I got your emails, you stupid Fs. Just like every company, so effing predictable, dumbasses. With 3 exclamation points at the end of that paragraph. No one knew what to think. The ministry didn't know whether to take these threats seriously or not. They're so poorly written, they're so hard for me to even read because of bad grammar. Punctuation doesn't even really exist. And no one knew who they were actually coming from, so how could they carry out the person's wishes to let them speak to Joyce or give their money back? It was anonymously sent. Chris stood in the way of people over the years, people that may have wanted to hurt Joyce. Who knows who this person could have been? It could be anyone. After Chris relayed the messages to Sheri, she was terrified. There was no other choice. They had to report these emails to the police, and that's exactly what Chris decided to do. On Monday morning, Chris shows up at Columbia Police Department. He tells the local office that this is what's happening. But they tell him he really needs to file a report over in Missouri because that's where Joyce's headquarters are, and because the threats are due to the relationship between him and his employer. Chris is worried about his family, though. He won't leave until the police agree to keep an extra eye out and patrol their neighborhood, especially because he's away a lot, and he's really concerned. But no one knew, again, whether to take these threats seriously. And then as quickly as they started, they just stopped. They all had tried to put it behind them. They moved on. Thanksgiving came and went, and next was Christmas. But first, right before the holidays, Chris had to take Joyce all the way to Florida so that she could board a cruise safely for her winter vacation. And then he would be back with his family. The threats were hardly in their minds because so much was going on. Before Sheri knew it, Chris was back for Christmas, and there was a lot to update him on and so much going on, but they could hardly enjoy the holiday. Because by January 2nd, something terrifying happened. It was worse than an email. Someone had actually deposited a threatening letter into Chris and Sheri's mailbox right outside their home. And it was not mailed. It was placed there. This person knew where they lived and had gotten that close to them without being seen. Chris immediately called the Columbia PD. They sent Officer Steve Patton over there to view the letter and to speak with Sheri and Chris and take a police report. The letter was typed. It said, quote, "F you, deny your God publicly or else, no opportunities, time is running out for you and your family. Have a good time in India, mother effer," end quote. Chris was scheduled to leave in less than 2 weeks for a trip with Joyce to India on January 15th through 18th, and he was very concerned that this lunatic would use his absence as an opportunity to do harm to his family, especially since they had already made their way to his home. So Columbia Police Chief Joe Edwards went ahead and increased security in that area. This made Sheri feel a little bit better. At least when she looked outside, she would see a cop car and she felt safer. But she had been in the military. She knew how to use weapons and she owned a firearm, so she loaded it and prepared to have it ready in case someone came into their home to harm her family. She also asked a friend, Jessica Wade from Destiny Church, if she would stay with her while Chris was gone. Jessica had never seen Sheri so uptight and scared. She even showed Jessica her firearm and taught her how to use it, saying that she had to know, just in case. They were all the kids had. They had to be ready to protect them. It was a life or death situation in Sheri's mind, and she needed to be sure that every adult in that house was well-versed in how to defend them. Chris let Joyce know what was going on as well. She could tell how worried he was, especially after this letter showed up in his mailbox. But Chris was the security guy. He's the one everyone would go to. So though he was concerned, he still wasn't convinced that it wasn't just someone trying to annoy his family, someone who took issue with their lifestyle or with Joyce herself. As for Sheri, she had every reason to be afraid. Someone had already come to their property to hand deliver that threatening letter. They seemed unwell. Who knows what they're capable of? Sheri was texting and calling everyone, including her in-laws, letting them know what was happening, hoping someone would help them, protect them, or ease Sheri's fears. And she had a lot of friends that she reached out to. Kathy LaPlante, her friend Karen from Destiny Church, and others from there as well, like Phil and Linda Stern, who were the founding pastors of that church. She just asked them for prayers. She texted Larry Bridges. He also worked at Destiny Church as a youth pastor and knew her boys very well. He told her to keep in touch with him and let him know if there's anything that he could do. Sheri just said that she was going to be at church next week, and until then, she was going to go to prayer meetings every day. She also let Pastor Vincent Hall know all about what's going on. She wanted to reach out to as many people as possible because she believed that what they could offer that would be the most powerful was prayer. And that's what she was asking for. Poor Sheri reached out to everyone, anyone. She needed prayer. She called Stephanie Jones, the Destiny Church worship leader, again asking to pray for her and her family. Sheri wasn't done. She also let Tara know what was going on. She was far away, but she lended her an ear and encouragement. Then Sheri went on to exchange texts with Christina Sincota, a longtime friend who also worked for Joyce. Even though Sheri had so many people praying for her, comforting her, and offering their time and support, it didn't make her feel any better. Even with Chris texting her almost every hour when he was in India, nothing helped. The stress was getting the best of her. Between not having her husband there to merely help out with the boys, to taking on so much responsibility, trying to help others, study for her medical technician classes, and now deal with a psycho that could harm her family, Sheri was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Jessica, who was staying with her, tried her best to console her, and friends would drop by to check in. Finally, Chris came back, but he was exhausted. Traveling overseas is very draining, not to mention having to deal with crowds of people and Joyce's demands. Chris was doing his best to be there for Sheri, but also relax a bit after he worked so much. A longtime friend from childhood actually gifted him with Super Bowl tickets. So he was looking forward to a few days of kicking back and celebrating, especially to get his mind off of everything. But that meant going out of town yet again. Not too long after he got back, it was the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Arizona Cardinals, and they were playing out in Tampa. And Sheri wasn't thrilled. She didn't want to come off as ungrateful for how hard Chris was working because, after all, she got to go off to Chicago with her friends and go shopping and eat at nice restaurants, socialize, and all Chris ever did was work. But Sheri was concerned and she couldn't hide it. She gave Chris a hard time. She was kind of guilt-tripping him just about being out of the country, the boys needing their dad, missing their anniversary. Sheri needed him. She begged him not to go. To be frank, Sheri had had it. She truly lived a good lifestyle, but what was all of this without a husband? She started to think that he cared about Joyce over her, maybe even had some kind of weird emotional connection with Joyce, because if Joyce told Chris to jump, he would jump. Sheri had no one to place her frustration on, and Joyce seemed to be the real issue. Even the threats were because Chris worked with her. So she decided to go to the source with her concerns, Joyce herself. The best she could do was get in contact with Joyce's son, Daniel, who handled all things related to his mom's business, and Daniel gladly listened to Sheri's concerns and said that he would bring it up to his parents and see what they could do. That was a pretty bold move. Joyce called Chris into her office the very next day and spoke to him, and he was pretty disappointed that Sheri had gone behind his back and spoken to the Meyers, especially because this was God's path for him and their main source of income. He called Sheri before arriving back home, and he expressed his disapproval, but when he walked through the door, he did his best to be there for his wife. This was a stressful time for them. He let Sheri know he would do whatever he could to make sure she was happy. He told her how much he loved the boys and how much they meant to him, how much he loved her. Over the next few days, they had a great time together. They did everything that Sheri loved. And maybe it was because, he wanted to make things right so that he could go to the Super Bowl, because ultimately she told Chris that she had no problem with him going. Or maybe it was because, things were good again. Everyone had even put the threats on the back burner. It was out of their mind. And when Chris was gone, Sheri kept the positivity and connection going by texting and flirting with him, even sending him a few risque pictures to say look what you're missing back home. And by February, Sheri was back to her old self. She even got a part-time job at the mall at a store called Buckle. That way she could feel like she was contributing to the household and keeping herself busy. By this time, she actually completed all of her required schooling to become an emergency medical technician, and she hoped that she would be able to find work in her area. More importantly, she wanted to volunteer her time on missions trips helping people in need. By mid-February, Chris and Sheri were planning a summer vacation for them and the kids. The plan was to fly to Orlando and go to Disney World. Sheri called and made the reservations for July well in advance so Chris could request off. But it seemed no matter what was going on, there was something brewing. All of a sudden, friends were calling and texting Sheri concerned about something they noticed on Facebook. She was like, "What's going on?" They said, "We saw your marital status. It went from married to single, and then your name changed back to your maiden name. What is going on?" As Christians, divorce was a big deal. Everyone looked up to Chris and Sheri as role models of the perfect family and relationship, so that really confused many of them. But Sheri was like, "Slow down. I can explain, it's not what it looks like." It turns out Sheri had decided to change her name and disconnect herself from Chris and her family because she was scared. She started to be harassed on Facebook. Someone was sending hateful messages about how much she didn't deserve her life or the family she had. She wasn't good enough for Chris. But changing her name did nothing to stop these messages. Why was someone so adamant about causing the Colemans so much stress? What had they done to them? The messages wouldn't stop, so finally Sheri just deactivated her entire Facebook account. It's like this family cannot catch a break. In March, Chris was in Arizona at a charity football event, and he would be on tour with Joyce, visiting destinations all over the world from Hong Kong to Singapore and then across California. He would be back for a little while, but then he would be off again to Hawaii by April 15th on another trip with Joyce. Meanwhile, Sheri put up curtains to cover their bay windows, something she thought would be wise in case the person that was sending these threats was watching them like they said they were. She still had her guard up, and it was actually Kathy's idea for her to get something to cover those windows. She didn't think Sheri was taking the threats seriously enough, especially because Sheri would joke around that she didn't need to be protected and she really didn't need to be scared because she had the best protection of all, her Smith & Wesson. That thing went everywhere with her. She had it by her side, in her bag, on her nightstand. It's a gun, if you didn't know that. Everyone that knew her knew she had a gun, and she even brought it to church with her. By Easter Sunday, April 12th, Chris and Sheri had Chris's parents over, as well as his brothers, Keith and Brad. It seemed like things had finally gotten back to normal, but of course, Chris would be leaving once again in just a couple days, so it was back to worrying. And Sheri was right to worry. On Monday, April 27th, Chris was once again back at home and at the Columbia Police Department holding yet another threatening letter. He was so tired of this. He showed them the letter. It was just like all of the others. It said, F you. I'm giving you the last warning. You have not listened to me, and you have not changed your ways. I have warned you to stop traveling and to stop carrying on with this fake religious life of stealing people's money. You think you're so special to do what you do protecting or think you're protecting her. She's a bitch and not worth you doing it. Stop today or else. I know your schedule. You can't hide from me. I'm always watching. I know when you leave in the morning, and I know when you stay home. I saw you leave this morning. I will be watching. You better stop traveling and doing what you were doing. Then in all caps it read, quote, this is my last warning. Your nightmare is about to happen, exclamation point, end quote. And that is so scary. The police decided it was time to put a detective on the case, and not just any detective, a neighbor of the Colemans who lived just across the street. Here in the Columbia Lakes neighborhood, his name was Detective Justin Barlow. This case was personal to him because this was his neighborhood too. And even though he hadn't seen anything unusual, he was determined to get to the bottom of it. After going over the case with the chief, they decided to set up a video camera in Detective Barlow's 3-year-old son's bedroom of his house, facing out the window toward the Coleman's front yard, with the mailbox in full view. This is what the viewpoint looked like. Then Barlow explained everything to Chris, and they exchanged phone numbers. If Chris and Sheri heard or saw anything suspicious, Detective Barlow told him to give him a call. The camera was all set up by Tuesday, April 28th, and everyone was trying to help. Even Chris's younger brother Keith offered to stay with Sheri when Chris was gone, but that could wait for now. They felt secure knowing a detective was on the case, and a camera was recording everything in the front yard. Besides, Chris himself was installing a security surveillance system. They would have cameras that would capture video inside and outside of their residence. He just needed a few more things to get it all up and running. And the Colemans just tried to get back to normal. They had the LaPlants over for dinner on May 1st, and it was a fun family night. Chris even stopped Sheri from even bringing up any of the negative things that they had been experiencing so that they could just have an enjoyable night together. The next couple days were normal. Chris got a haircut. He had actually been growing his shaved head out, trying out a new look for the summer, I guess. And Sheri was getting her passport pictures for a mission trip that she was planning. May 4th was another ordinary night. The family had dinner, and then they went to get some dessert together. Then Chris played catch outside with the boys until it was time to settle in. While Chris went to the gym real quick to get in a workout, he was back in time to tuck the boys in and say goodnight. Then Chris and Sheri cuddled on the couch together watching Batman Returns. It was an ordinary night, but tomorrow would be anything but. On Tuesday, the 5th of May, 2009, Chris left home at 5:30 a.m. and drove to the gym for his morning workout. It was a route that he'd taken hundreds of times before. He called Sheri on the way to make sure she was out of bed and getting the boys ready for school. Except on this day, Sheri didn't answer the phone. A few minutes later, he called again. And once again, there was no answer. When he got to the gym, he sent a few texts to his wife, all with no response. Part of him thought she was just busy with the boys or her morning routine, but another part of him was really worried considering all of the threats. But they had a camera. There was a detective on their case. He'd only be a few more minutes and then he would come home. So Chris completed his workout around 6:42 in the morning and he drove home, but he made another call. This time it was to one of his neighbors, Detective Justin Barlow, who was the detective with the Columbia Police Department in charge of the camera facing Chris's mailbox. Chris was concerned that Sheri wasn't answering his calls, so he asked Barlow if he could walk over to the house and check on Sheri and the boys, telling him he has reached out via text and called her a number of times, and he's still not able to make contact. At this point, Chris told the detective that he would be home soon. He was just racing across the JB Bridge, just 5 minutes away. Detective Barlow was acting as a concerned neighbor and friend, but also as an officer. He agreed to go over and make sure everything was okay. He immediately jumped into action. He grabbed his weapon, handcuffs, and a radio and reported the situation to a dispatcher. He needed to make sure that he had backup just in case. Then he ran across the road to the Coleman's home and began banging on the front door, just as a police vehicle was arriving to the address. The second officer on the scene was Officer Jason Donjon. While Barlow continued knocking and ringing the doorbell, he looked into the windows by the front door and he couldn't see anything. It was dark inside. There were no lights on at all, and he couldn't see anyone moving around inside. At the same time, Donjon walked around to the back of the house to see if anything was out of place or if he could make contact with anyone. Moments later, he radioed to Barlow to say that he found an open window and a security screen was missing. It looked like there had been forced entry made into the basement. So Barlow immediately called dispatch for backup and joined Donjon at the back of the home. Barlow had a bad feeling. With everything he knew about the threats against the Coleman family, he believed they were in danger. One after the other, they climbed in through that open window and into the dark basement. With their guns drawn and flashlights, they slowly mounted the steps that led to the main floor of the home. They were announcing themselves all along the way, yelling, "Columbia Police!" As they got to the top of the stairs, that's when they smelled something. It was a very distinctive smell, and they could smell it before they could see it. It was a strong smell of spray paint. These steps led them into the Coleman's kitchen. As they continued into the home, that's when they saw it. Blood red on the walls. It was spray paint. Across the kitchen wall, there were the words, "F you, I'm always watching." Right away, this looks just like the messages in the threats. They had jumped off the computer screen into the family's mailbox, and now they were written on the walls of their home. This wasn't good. By this time, Officer Patton had arrived. He radioed in, and Barlow tells him to come inside and meet them in the kitchen. Just as Barlow and Donjon turn the corner, they see another message on a connecting wall in the kitchen. It says, "I saw you leave." It was as though this message was directed at Chris. We know the letters warned that the person was watching and that they knew Chris's schedule, that they were going to wait until he wasn't home to carry out his worst nightmare. All three officers were in shock. Had it really come true? So many thoughts were probably going through their minds, but they needed to act fast and press on to try to make sure that Sheri and the kids were okay. As they moved out of the kitchen into the living room, yet another message was on the wall. It said, "F you, bitch." Underneath it, it just said one word, "punished." Officers moved past this area and quickly to the stairs that led up to the floor with the bedrooms. As they approached the staircase, they could see another horrifying message on the wall that led upstairs. This one said, "You have paid." And they were about to understand what all of these messages meant. All three bedrooms were on the top floor. To the left was Sheri and Chris's bedroom, and to the right were both Gavin and Garrett's rooms. All three officers chose a different bedroom to enter, each one with their own horrifying fate. Of course, there was a lot of yelling to one another about what each of them had found. And then they met back up in the hallway upstairs, shaking, shocked, and in disbelief, because all three of them had found someone deceased. All of them were just saying, "Oh my God." Nothing could have prepared them for this. Barlow made the call to dispatch, simply saying, "We have 3 people down, 1 adult and 2 juveniles." It's true. Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin were no longer alive. All 3 of them were murdered. The Coleman family had been destroyed. At the same time, Patton called in for their chief and Donjon radioed for crime scene techs. All 3 officers were now going into another room, starting with ones that they had not yet had a chance to examine. Peeking out over the covers, Barlow could see the outline of Garrett's face. The boy appeared to be asleep, except his skin was gray and there was no movement under the covers. The 11-year-old was dead. There were marks around his little neck indicating he was strangled. It's just so sad. All of it is, when Barlow entered the main bedroom, 31-year-old mom Sheri was in the bed. You could clearly see 3 distinctive ligature marks on her neck. This was a clear sign of a struggle. She was trying to break free from her killer every time they tried to cut off her air supply. She would move as much as she could to get out of their grip, but no matter how much military training she had, or how strong she was, or how strong her will to live was, knowing her boys could be harmed next, she was no match for this monster. She fought so hard she had bruises all over her face and a black eye. Don John was now in Garrett's room. He had never witnessed a child deceased before. He couldn't take it. He had 2 sons. This could not be real. Then he moved into Gavin's room. The scene in the room of the youngest member of the Coleman family was one Don John couldn't shake. There was little Gavin, no more smiles, no more dancing or laughter. He was lifelessly laying on his bed in a pair of Spider-Man pajamas, and Don John's son had the same ones. What was even more morbid was the spray paint that was on Gavin's body. The message was heartless and obscene. It was across the bedspread and partially on Gavin. It read, F you. Who would want to hurt an innocent child? He too had been strangled to death. At this point, it's been 13 minutes since Chris called Barlow asking him to go check on his family, and now he's literally pulling into his driveway. The 3 officers were still consumed with the heartbreaking discovery that they were startled when they heard someone yelling from downstairs. They realized it's Chris, so they jump into action. They do not want this father and husband seeing what they just witnessed. Chris was asking what's going on and already making his way inside the home. Barlow ran downstairs, practically pushing and forcing Chris to turn back around and get back out of the house. He told him, "You cannot come in here." He felt awful speaking to this man in such a harsh tone, but he couldn't let him see what was upstairs. Barlow guided Chris out the garage door while he kept asking, "Where is my family and why can't I go inside?" Chris took a seat on the ground of the driveway, waiting to find out what was going on. Barlow kneeled down, getting eye to eye with his neighbor. He looked at him, fear in his eyes, and said, "Chris, they didn't make it." Chris, confused and shocked, was like, "What do you mean they didn't make it?" But it didn't take long for Chris to realize what Barlow meant, and tears started to well up in his eyes. He was sobbing as tears began to roll down his face. He told Barlow he thought he may throw up. Then he laid down in the fetal position. After minutes of this, Chris seemed out of it, like he didn't know what he should do. He started saying things like, "Oh my God, I have to call my dad, I've got to call my work," and he just kept repeating these things, like he wasn't sure where to turn or what to do. But he did do those 2 things. He called Joyce Meyer Ministries to let them know that his family was dead. Can you imagine uttering those words? And next, he had to call his parents. He called his dad screaming, saying something happened to Sheri and the boys. His father couldn't make sense of it. It was like Chris was in shock and he was out of it. He told his dad he had no idea what was going on because no one would give him any information. All he knows is his family is dead. When Connie heard what happened, she couldn't even think. There's nothing that can ever prepare you to hear that 3 people you love have been killed. The ambulance sirens rang out as officers started to put up that yellow crime scene tape around the Coleman's property to secure the area. This small police department, they knew they could not handle a triple homicide on their own, so they called in the Illinois State Police for assistance. It didn't take long for the entire neighborhood to be buzzing with vehicles. It was obvious to everyone who lived in close proximity to the Coleman's home that something terrible had happened. Neighbors began coming outside. They wanted to know what was going on. Vanessa Rigoro, Sheri's close friend, neighbor, and Brandon's mother, is getting her son ready for school and to take little snacks to his classmates to celebrate his 9th birthday. When Brandon noticed all the commotion at the Coleman's home, he wondered what had gone on. Just the night before, Brandon had played with his friends Gavin and with Garrett, who had just turned 11 a few days ago. Brandon was supposed to have a sleepover last night, something the boys did every year to celebrate their birthdays, but it didn't happen. And now cop cars were there. Vanessa texted Sheri immediately asking, "Is everything okay?" And of course, she never got a response. By this time, so many people close to Chris and his family were on the scene. His father, Ron, pulls up. doesn't even take the keys out of his car. He just runs to be by his son's side. And Joyce is also there. Ron is frantic. He's trying to figure out what is going on. It's apparent his daughter-in-law and grandkids are dead. And there's a lot of emotion swirling around. One was anger toward the police. He blamed them. He said they should have taken the threats more seriously, and now look what happened. He yelled that they hadn't done enough to prevent this from happening. Police Chief Joe Edwards is also present. He's assessing the scene and speaking with Chris as Chaplain Jonathan Peters turned to Chris and actually says the words, "Your family has been killed." Now Chris has officially been informed of the real-life nightmare that is played out. An ambulance pulls up and they coax Chris to get inside to take a seat to calm down. He climbs inside with the chaplain and they pray together. Joyce and her husband come and pray with them as well. And that's when, all of a sudden, Chris begins banging his fists against the gurney, just letting out all of his emotions, anger and fear, anything that was inside of him in this unbelievable moment. Joyce and Dave Meyer tell the captain, Paul, that they're available if they need anything, and they exchange phone numbers. They also tell him that they will notify Sheri's parents since they know all of her information and knew Sheri well. Meanwhile, the chief's help has arrived. About 25 officers from the Special Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis, led by Major Jeff Connor of the Granite City Police Department. He's there to take over. Chief Edwards didn't want just anyone. He didn't want to take his chances. He wanted this case solved and a psycho caught and taken off the streets as soon as possible. So he went with the team with the most expertise, and they begin the investigation right away. Of course, even though they know it's going to be hard on him, they want to speak to Chris about the threats, about what he heard or saw last, anything that can point them in the right direction. They also send crime scene technicians into the home and call the medical examiner's office to transport the 3 decedents to the morgue for autopsies. It's all happening so fast. And it's Major Connor's job to organize everything in this investigation. There's a lot of moving parts. He's apprised of the situation, of all of the death threats, of what Chris does for a living and for whom. There's people to interview in the neighborhood, Chris and Sheri's family, of course, and to notify them. They ask Chris for Sheri's parents' number, and he's such a wreck that he tells them he has no idea, and he has a new BlackBerry that doesn't have any phone numbers programmed in it yet. The investigators also want to speak to Joyce and anyone in her ministry that may have knowledge of the threats on the Coleman family. The neighborhood also needs to be canvassed. The video footage needs to be collected from Detective Barlow's home, and units have been set up to make sure the killer is not still running around able to hurt Chris or anyone else. Maybe finish the job now that Joyce is on scene. Catch them all at their most vulnerable moment. Their biggest lead right now are all the emails and letters, some of which Columbia PD already have on hand from Chris's previous reports. This is the first thing they focused on. They gathered up all the known threats, and they were looking for patterns, something that would stand out. There was no handwriting in this case, but something that's apparent, and I noticed this too. I mean, of course, the bad grammar, but even more the misspellings. For example, the word opportunities and publicly were both spelled wrong. On one sentence where it said no more opportunities, it had a U instead of an O. And the sentence deny your God publicly had publicly spelled with 2 L's instead of 1. And that matters. Things were happening so fast with so many experts on this case. They were getting stuff done quickly. They wanted to do everything they could for this family and for Chris, who was still at the crime scene. There was so much going on, so much no one would want to see, especially a loved one. Like gurneys being rolled out of the house. Sheri and the boys transported off of the scene. I even saw a hearse in one of the videos. I thought victims were put into ambulances, but apparently there was a hearse called out. And then there was the media that started to show up, and Detective Barlow really didn't want Chris to have to face all of this. So he took him back to the Columbia Police Station, tried to calm him down, and of course the hard part, speak to him about what could have happened. So he's being transported by ambulance to the police station, his father's following close behind, and meanwhile officers are scouring this neighborhood. They're doing 2 things. They're knocking on doors, they're interviewing neighbors, but they're also looking for any evidence. This means collecting trash, going through garbage bins, because the killer could have disposed of evidence or left something behind. They also call the sanitation department and they tell them to do a trash hold, meaning do not pick up from this area until further notice. This will give them some time to go through all the bins for clues. They even took the covers off the sewers. It's around 10 a.m. You can see Chris in this video. He's just rocking back and forth with his head in his hands. He's sobbing. There's a lot of firsthand information to gather in this interview, which I think is very important as things progress. Since I have the footage, I'm going to show it, but I will also explain. And I don't know, I'll do my best to do subtitles as well. They don't always work correctly, sometimes get it wrong, and that would be worse than just listening. But at least the audio isn't really that bad in this video. So here they are giving Chris a place to sit in the interview room at the station. They give him a bottle of water, then they read him his Miranda rights, which are customary, and they ask him to recount his day.
I'll tell you what, from the beginning, let's just start up from when you got up this morning until the time you pulled up at the house. Just kind of walk me through that first, and then we'll go through and kind of explain, talk about some different things as far as the emails you've been getting, okay?
Well, I set my alarm clock for 5:30 and then used my phone for my alarm clock. And got up at 5:30, went to the bathroom, put these clothes here I got on, and went to the bathroom, basically got in the truck and left. And drove off. I got to where I was at, but called Sheri to wake her up, get her going, and she didn't answer, of course. And so I went on to the gym, to Gold's Gym, over by Ronnie's Plaza in South County, and started working out. I text her at some point. I might even have called her again. I don't remember. I could probably look at my phone if you want me to.
Did you guys have a home phone number too, or just cell phones?
No, we just used cell phones. So I text her, and then she still didn't respond, and probably now it had to have been after 6 o'clock sometime when I texted her or called her. I'm sure it's still on her phone what time it was. Okay. And she didn't respond. That's not like her, because the kids should have been up and stuff, or getting up and going by then, I believe. And so I called her again. Called her again on the way back, or when I was getting ready to leave, and she didn't respond again, and I started getting a little concerned because it's not like her not to answer the phone. Sometimes she won't answer if she's in the shower, but she always calls me back right away. And so she didn't do that at all. So that's when I called you.
So what time did you text her back? The second time?
I can tell you.
6:23. So at 6:23 a.m. is when you first texted her this morning. It says, "Hey, baby, are you awake?" That's something.
Had you tried to call before that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can pull up the call log too if you want me.
Okay, that just does text. I'm sorry. All right, so you're just looking at text, and how are those out, Justin?
So the first one is from you. It says, "Hey, baby, are you
6:23. I'm sorry.
6:23 a.m. And then she doesn't respond to you, correct?
It would be on there.
Oh, right. Okay. And so the second one from you says, "I know you was tired last night." 6:23 says, "I have about 5 minutes left on cardio, then I'll be home." And she never responded to any of them because I could tell them. Yeah, I could tell them the phone. Okay. And then at 7:27 it says, "Hello, you up?"
7:27.
I'm sorry, 6:27. 6:27. And then at the same time, at 6:27, another one goes out and says, "Time to get the kids up."
We know everything I've already told you, but you're hearing it firsthand from Chris himself. We also know from Chris's phone, the first text went out to Sheri from Chris at 6:23 a.m. saying, "Hey babe, are you awake?" And a couple others telling her he was almost done working out and that he would be home soon. And another asking like, "Hey, are you up?" Then Barlow asked if Chris noticed anything out of the ordinary, and he says the only thing he recalls was a car backing out of a driveway. It was when he was leaving that morning, but he doesn't know what kind of car or which driveway.
Anything as far as that sticks out in your mind from this morning? I mean, when you left, did you notice anything?
The only thing I told somebody was, the only thing I can remember is having to slow down for a car backing out of the driveway. That's it.
From which driveway were they backing out?
I don't know. He answered the same thing. It's like 3 or 4 out. I don't know. On the left-hand side. That's the only thing I remember.
You notice anything about the car?
It was just a darker color. The only thing. I'm sorry. I should have been more observant.
Anything anything that sticks out? I mean, were you able to tell him like what kind of car it was? I mean, did you recognize it in the neighborhood at all? Or?
No, I was just backing into the driveway. I didn't even.
Now about the evidence they had at this point. The biggest lead were the threats. So they made a point to go and backtrack to everyone who was ever connected to Joyce as someone who made a threat against her. Even people in other countries, they were tracked down, and they all had solid alibis for the time of the crime. They asked Chris if, out of all the emails he'd ever gotten, any of those threats, has any stood out to him. And he said he just didn't know. And he repeated he just wished he would have been there that day.
Kind of going back to when you first came here back in November last year, you were getting some of those emails sent to your work email address, right? Do you still have those on your computer?
I could look.
Okay.
They might be on the server. You know.
Okay. All right.
I doubt if they're on the computer because it deletes them after so long.
Kind of purges them out, type of thing.
I wouldn't think they'd be on the server.
And how many threats like that? I mean, up until November, have you ever gotten threats like that before?
No, people have been upset with me, but I haven't gotten anything. I mean, I've had people yell at me and cuss at me and everything else, but, you know, and escort them off the property and all that stuff, you know. If I just been there this morning, I'd leave.
What we're gonna do, you know, Chris, we're gonna get past that, okay? We're gonna work this out and get through it, all right?
They also asked him about the cameras that he had set up in the house. Remember that? He said, yeah, I had an entire system, and the video should be there. It's all in the basement. And now for the part where they ask him about his marriage. They always have to do this. Were there any problems in Chris and Sheri's marriage? They want to know. He says no, that there were times when communication was hard between him and Sheri, but they had a great relationship. They also asked what Sheri thought about his job with Joyce. And that's when Chris kind of broke down again. He said that Sheri, of course, preferred that he would have a 9-to-5 job so that he could spend more time with the family. And he wished he would have been there for his family. They asked about whether he had Joyce's cell phone number, and he was like, I don't usually give it to people. And the detectives were like, I think it's okay to make an exception. Joyce is going to understand, because they really wanted to talk to her. And then they asked him, what did you do the night before your family was murdered? Chris said that there was nothing exceptional or unusual about that night. He'd run a couple of errands, he picked up the kids from school, he played catch with Garrett, and waited on Sheri to get home. She got off work at 4. And then she actually made dinner, pasta and chicken, and she cut up some kind of pizza and mixed it all together, he said. After dinner, they went and got snow cones, and Chris played catch with Gavin and Garrett. Then the boys went to bed, and Chris and Sheri watched Batman Returns on TV. He added that Sheri fell asleep in his arms on the couch. Then they got undressed, brushed their teeth, and went to bed. But of course, Chris went down and made sure that all the doors and the windows were locked first. They asked him what Sheri wore to bed, and he said nothing. He slept, and she slept without clothes. Sheri was found without clothing, so that's why they asked. Now, in these interviews, the detectives will go over the same questions a few times. They ask it different ways. They probe a little more. They kind of ease into certain things. And again, they want to know about Chris and Sheri's relationship. He said, you know, they had gone through some rough patches. They had been together for, I think, close to 12 years now. So he admits that even as recently as December of that last year, they had talked about divorce. But they went to Joyce Meyer, and they were able to get someone to do counseling with them, and they'd been going to counseling together, and Chris said that things were going really great. But of course, they have to ask about everything, even their sex life, whether Chris had an affair, and he said no. But he did admit something that they weren't expecting him to say. He said that he's been talking to one of Sheri's friends, Tara, and that they had been friends since childhood. Sheri knew that they were all friends, and that he helped her when she came to the conference in Tampa so that she could get situated with everything, and they remained in touch. So here is what the investigators asked him.
We kind of talked about the divorce a little bit.
This last December?
Yeah, and I went to Joyce with it, told her about it, or Danny, I can't remember which one, and they knew about it, and they suggested that we meet with somebody and see if we could work out whatever it was. And really all it was just communication. communicate very well. And so,
Did you meet with somebody?
yeah, Mike Shepard, the guy that's here downstairs in the lobby.
Okay.
He's and we've been meeting with him pretty regularly, and things have been going pretty awesome.
How often do you meet with him? I mean, you said regularly.
He travels overseas a lot too, and so as often as me and him schedule, I'd say on average maybe once a week.
Had you seen anyone else outside of your wife in a romantic way?
No. Tara in Florida, I've talked to her a ton lately, but.
And what's with that? I mean, what's
just a friend, somebody to talk to.
So you heard that they asked if there has ever been anything inappropriate between him and Tara, and he hesitates a little bit and then admits, well, maybe a few inappropriate text messages, but other than that, no. Detective Bevins asked, well, could that friendship have ever progressed into anything else? And he's like, no, I wouldn't do that to my kids. And I thought that was very interesting, the way he put that. It doesn't mean because you had an affair that you did something to your family, but it just made me think. Okay, so now they have a name of a person that they can get additional information from. So they step out to give this information to one of the other investigators to go track down Tara Lynn's in St. Petersburg. But they really don't want to have these conversations over the phone. She's already nervous when she gets a call from them. She even says, do I need an attorney or something? And they're like, why? Did you do something wrong? And she's like, no, I just found out that my good friend and her kids are dead. Chris's dad had called her to let her know. So the investigators decide to contact the St. Petersburg Police Department and get a homicide detective to go out there and interview Tara in person, to ask her what she knows about the family, what she knows about Chris, whether the marriage was on good terms, and of course all about Sheri because she would know her so well, being a childhood friend. It wasn't long before the investigators are given information that St. Petersburg homicide investigators are at Tara's condo speaking with her. And she's giving them a lot of information, including the fact that Chris was having an affair. And it's with her. I know some of you knew it, but yes, it's true. I wish it wasn't. Tara actually says that Chris Coleman is her boyfriend. So I have some of that interview. Here's where Tara explains how long this cheating has been going on and that the marriage was not perfect, like everyone thought it was.
How long have you been in a relationship with Chris?
Since late November, early December.
Where all you guys been together?
Phoenix and Hawaii, Maui.
What would you tell his wife when he was gone?
He would have just told it that he was working.
So Sheri was not aware of the affair that you and him were having?
No, I know she suspected, but.
Wow. So of course, they confront Chris with this new information. This is not looking good for Chris. Then while they're still in the interview room, the investigators get another text. And this one is about some new information regarding some evidence. So of course, they step out for a minute. Investigators were told that something stood out to the first responders on the scene. The bodies were already stiff. They were already cold and gray, and that raised a red flag, meaning that it seemed like they had been dead much longer than a mere hour that Chris had been gone from the home. What's more telling is that when medical technicians came in at 7 a.m., not too long after Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett were found, they observed Gavin's lips were blue and his eyelids had a purplish tinge to them. He was laying face down and one of his arms was outstretched. When they went to move it, it was stiff. Same when they went to examine Garrett. And these exact same observations were made with Sheri. It was apparent that rigor mortis had set in. If they had just been killed, the bodies would have been warm and their limbs would have been easy to be moved and manipulated, but that wasn't the case. And this was a very critical piece of information, so they called in an expert. They were told around 11 a.m. an investigator with the coroner's office was at the crime scene. Her specialty was core body temperature. They began with Sheri, and this is a process that's conducted by putting a thermometer into the liver. They also do this procedure on Garrett, but they waited on Gavin because there was evidence that needed to be collected next to his body. Core body temperature helps determine how long someone has been dead. They are checking for algor mortis. This is different from rigor mortis. Algor mortis means cold death. And what it refers to is the temperature shift after someone dies, because we all start with a core temperature of about 98.6 degrees. But when someone dies, their body temperature starts to drop and match the temperature of the room or their surroundings. This can take anywhere from 18 to 20 hours. So what they're doing is they're trying to determine when Sheri and the boys died. Apparently, there was a question as to the time of death, and they were leaning toward it being well before the time Chris left for the gym, which would mean Sheri and the boys were dead before he left. Well, the husband is always one of the first suspects that police look at, and they think now would be a good time to go a little harder on Chris, just to see what information they can get. They come back in, and there's no holding back. Let me play that part for you.
When you left the house this morning, was your wife alive?
Oh, yeah.
What would you say if I told you that I don't think she was?
I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I think she was. I mean, she was.
Okay.
She was laying right beside me.
Right. And I'm not doubting that. I'm not doubting that you were there, and I'm not doubting that you care. But I am doubting that she was alive when you left this morning. Physically, what we have are different ways to tell how long a person's been deceased. That was done. And what do you think that showed?
I don't know. I guess the time frame when I was gone. I mean...
No, you guess wrong. Chris, we need to get this resolved, okay? That you can't argue with physical evidence.
Right. I'm not trying to argue with it.
All right. What I'm telling you is there is no other explanation. There's no other reason that the information we have would support what you're telling us. That it can't. It can't. You've told us a story and we've gone over it numerous times. Right. You know what? We walk out to Justin, maybe we missed this. Let's go in and talk to him about this and just make sure that we're not missing something. Let's give him every opportunity to tell us exactly what happened and maybe we're missing something. Right. So that's why we go out and we come back in and we go out and we come back in. Right. I did have to use the restroom, that was legitimate, but we go out and we come back in. And we felt very comfortable that we were giving you every opportunity to tell us something that was going to contradict the information that we had. Mm-hmm. All right, we've got this information, you're saying it, and we're giving you opportunity to give us something contrary to what you told us before, so that, okay, yeah, all right, that would make sense. That hasn't happened. That hasn't happened. Listen, man, she wasn't alive when you left.
She was alive. She was laying right beside me.
Listen to me. We can go back and forth with this all day long, but the physical evidence doesn't lie, man. She was not alive when you left this morning. The children weren't alive when we left this morning.
Yes, they were.
No, come on, Chris. We got to get over this. Now, there's reasons, and that's the point we're at. I want to hear the reasons. Now is when we need to find out what happened, man. It's so important. You're at a great point to be able to help us to try to figure this out. We already know what happened.
Now, I just have to stop there because I want you to recognize the tactics that these investigators are using. Some people don't always agree, but they're really pressing him, and they're acting as if they already know everything. But at this point, they only have assumptions from the evidence. They haven't proved anything yet, but they're showing him what they have and positioning it in a way that can get them what they want, which is a confession, because that means their job would be done. But Chris is pushing back. He's sobbing. He's saying that's not what happened. And the investigators are saying, you know what, Chris? Just help us out. Help us solve this. Don't you want to solve it? That's a tactic. It's supposed to make him feel like he's working with them as a team, that they're not against him. And they continue.
We need to know why it happened.
I know what to tell you.
Listen, no, you do know what to tell us.
No, I don't.
Come on, Chris. She was not alive when you left. The children were not alive when you left. You know that's true, and I know that's true.
No, it just...
We need to clear this up now. We need to clear it up now. Did something happen? What happened?
Nothing happened.
What was going on in your life, Chris? Because I can't buy what you're saying. The physical evidence does not lie, Chris. It does not. She was not alive when you left, period. The physical evidence does not lie, man.
What do you want me to tell you?
The truth.
I'm telling you the truth.
How did we get to this point? That's what I need to know. I need to know how and why we got to the point we're at right now. We both know you're not telling me the truth. We both know that. I've done this a long time. I'm looking into your eyes, and I can tell you, you're not being truthful, Chris. We need an answer. We need our answers. As bad as this sounds, as bad as this looks, or you may think it looks, we understand, and I've talked to many people who have given me reasons, and it's like, you know what? Okay, all right, I can understand how somebody might have been feeling that at that time. And maybe they acted on it and they shouldn't have, and they regret it. There's no way to turn clocks back. You can't turn clocks back. You understand that, don't you? Right. You can't turn the clock back. The only thing we can do is go forward from this point, and we need to know what and why it happened. Come on, Chris, help me out with this.
I'm telling you, I've already told you. I've told everybody. I told the guy in the ambulance. I told you. I told him.
The more we go back like this, the more it makes me think that there maybe even isn't a good explanation for it. I mean.
Now you hear Detective Bevins telling Chris, maybe there's not a good explanation, because they're kind of giving him that out. They're sympathizing with him, saying, you know what, we've heard this many times before. Maybe there's a reason that something happened. What was it? And they're almost not really giving Chris a chance to answer. They're bombarding him with statement after statement and pressing him again and again. And Chris is still standing his ground, telling them he didn't do anything. He doesn't know what happened. They were alive when he left. But they don't stop.
We need to know what happened. We can't keep going on this. It didn't, she was alive when I left. We know that's not true, and there's nothing we can do about changing that. If we know she wasn't alive when you left this morning, there's got to be an explanation. Now is the time to tell us. Now is the time to get this out in the open.
I don't know what else to tell you.
Yes, you do. Yes,
No.
you do. You have to tell me the truth, Chris.
I'm telling you the truth.
Were you involved in her death?
No.
Okay. Was someone you know involved in her death?
I don't know.
Did you know? Did you talk to anybody about arranging her death?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Wow. And they asked him if he had anything to do with the murder, whether he arranged for them to be killed, whether he knew anyone that had done it. And he's like, I don't know. I have nothing to do with it. Absolutely not. He doesn't know who did it. Well, they can't hold him on anything because, like I said, they really don't have any proof of anything yet. They just have evidence. And there is still so much to be done. So Chris is released, and now I want to go back to that interview with Tara. She had explained that they got together when Sheri insisted that she attend Joyce's conference in Tampa so that she could discover her faith. But instead, Tara discovered Chris. He went out there a couple days before the conference began on November 6th, and when he got into town, he got in contact with Tara. They went out to dinner, they had some drinks together, and they did this the next night as well, and soon after that, they were sleeping together. It happened pretty fast. That vibrant spark in Sheri, which initially attracted Chris when they first met, had the same effect when he crossed paths with Tara at Joyce's event all of those years later. The pair already knew each other through Sheri, but their connection this time was far more than platonic. Just like what happened with Sheri, the relationship escalated quickly. By the time the event was over, which was just a few days, Chris and Tara were having a full-blown affair. And it was at a time when Sheri and Chris were actually going through that rough patch that he mentioned. That was true. They had been going through arguments over money and Sheri's excessive spending in Chris's perspective, and Sheri was talking to all of her friends about it. She would share it with anyone who would listen. She would tell them that she thought Chris was being distant, and this was before he got together with Tara. But it was a tense situation between him and Sheri, and Chris told people she was very controlling, that she never seemed happy no matter how hard he worked. Chris even told Tara, according to her, that he wasn't affectionate with Sheri anymore. Here is what Tara told investigators.
He always would take pictures when he was going to sleep to prove that, he wasn't sleeping with her or anything.
See, now to us, he tried to paint that it was a rosy, perfect marriage.
No, they never kissed, never hugged.
Wow. That's really, really sad. Remember, Sheri and Chris, they really didn't get to know each other very well before Sheri got pregnant. It happened very quickly. So they got thrown into a more serious relationship before they really got the chance to know one another. Like Mario had said from the beginning, they didn't take that time to really solidify themselves as a couple. But they did stay together for over a decade, and they were both trying until Tara entered Chris's life. And of course, Tara wasn't going to let him go because she had always been envious of Sheri since they were in high school. She wanted what Sheri and Chris had. Tara didn't have anything like that. Chris made good money, he could take her on lavish trips, spoil her, and that's exactly what he did. During the interview, Tara's boss calls and wants to know why she's not at work, or she calls them to tell them she's not coming in. You have to listen to this. I was so shocked by what this woman was saying. Here we go.
It's Tara. Hey, no, I'm in the middle of a really high-profile murder investigation. I've got a murder investigation. I'm right in the middle of it. I have 4 detectives here sitting at my house. They have no problem giving you proof or anything like that. I thought I was coming into work today.
Is she serious right now? She's like, I'm in the middle of not cooking or washing my hair. No. I'm in the middle of a high-profile murder investigation. I gotta go. I've got homicide detectives here. Really? And Tara didn't hold back. She told investigators everything. Plus, they did get access to her phone and every message she exchanged between her and Chris. Even though Chris sat there telling Sheri she was spending too much money, as soon as he and Tara got together, all he did was spend excessive amounts of money on this woman. He was under her spell. And I probably know what you're thinking. If you watch a lot of true crime, this is giving me Chris Watts and Nicole Kessinger vibes. And there's more that's probably going to remind you of that relationship, like the pictures that investigators saw that were exchanged between Tara and Chris. Oh, anytime they weren't together, they would just be sending them back and forth. Tara in this pink bikini reminded me so much of Nicole Kessinger and the pictures that she sent to Chris Watts. Not only that, just like in the Chris Watts situation, Chris Coleman seemed obsessed with Tara. And you will hear all about why as the investigators dug deeper and deeper into their affair. I mean, after that first encounter, it was like text message after text message. They would exchange all of these really inappropriate photos. And I mean inappropriate because Chris is married, but just very sexy photos back and forth. And they would talk about life together. All the while, Chris is playing nicely with his wife, sort of. I'll get into that in a moment. But remember, not too long after Chris got back from this trip to Tampa, when he had this affair with his wife's best friend from childhood, that's when he received the very first threatening email. That was on November 14th. So was this just a coincidence, or did Chris orchestrate this? I know it's easy to think Chris did this right away, but it had only been a few days after he met up with Tara and started this affair. It seems a little far-fetched that this man would put together this entire scheme to kill his whole family in just a few days after this affair started. So investigators are not convinced, but they want to know more about what was going on because they realize that he's been unfaithful. And they've seen this before. It doesn't always lead to murder, but it raises a red flag, and they have to look into this deeper. After that first meeting at Joyce's ministry event, Tara explained that Chris flew her out to meet him at almost every location he was working. From Hawaii to Texas, the pair were rarely apart except when Chris was at home with Sheri and the boys. However, Chris was far from the only man in Tara's life. She had a long-term boyfriend on the side, and get this, she was engaging in flirtatious and explicit text messages with Sheri's brother, Mario, and Chris's brother, Heath. And they were both interested in pursuing a relationship with Tara. I don't know whether Chris knew about these messages, who knows, but I would assume he did not. While Sheri was holding on to hope that they could rekindle their romance and save their marriage, Chris had already moved on. During sessions with the counselor, Chris would say that he was devoted to being a good husband and that there was a second chance left for them. But the minute he left, he would degrade Sheri and tell her it was never going to work out. We know this because investigators now have a warrant for Sheri's cell phone as well. And they're matching up the dates to see what Sheri was texting Chris and her friends. Chris kept in constant contact with Tara, and finally on Christmas Day, 2008, Chris told Sheri that he wanted a divorce. He offered one final insult when he told Sheri that Garrett and Gavin were getting in the way of his job and that he never wanted them in the first place. Sheri was heartbroken. She told her friends that Chris said this, and they were all offering prayers and advice to her. They thought she and Chris had the perfect relationship, so this came as a huge surprise. But now they had names of the friends who they needed to speak to. People like Vanessa and Kathy, friends who were very close to Sheri. There were so many texts to friends from Destiny Church. Remember that? Asking to please pray for her and Chris. Remember all of those prayer requests I told you about? Well, it turns out it was for their marriage to be repaired, not just because of the threats, because Sheri was desperate. She had texted a pastor at Destiny Church and told him everything. That Chris had said that the kids were standing in the way of his career, and then he wanted a divorce, and the pastor was shocked. He didn't even know what to say. He was stunned. He couldn't believe a couple that looked so perfect on the outside could be dealing with something like this. But she told him that she was not going to give up on her marriage. She just wanted people to pray for them. But Sheri also thought that Chris was hiding something from her, that she wasn't getting the entire picture of why he wanted to leave. Because she figured if Chris gets a divorce, Joyce is going to fire him. That's part of the job. It's essential to be a, quote, good Christian. And divorce is not something that Joyce tolerated. Remember how I told you that Sheri was texting everyone, letting them know what was going on? She was essentially airing their dirty laundry. She was asking for prayers. But what she really was doing was confiding in them. She would tell them each a little piece of the puzzle, but she never told anyone the whole story. And now officers are trying to piece this together. Before Christmas, Chris actually met up with Tara. Remember when he had to take Joyce to that cruise? Well, of course, this was another opportunity to meet up with Tara since he was in Florida. This is when they literally exchanged promise rings. I am not kidding. He was doting on this woman, took her to a concert, stayed in a nice hotel with her, even got a joint credit card and another one so that he could charge all of the gifts that he was buying and Sheri wouldn't be able to find out. I'm just sitting here thinking, forget about Chris for a moment. How can you do this to your best friend? Someone that you've practically known your whole life, and you can just betray them like that? And she sat there and still talked to Sheri. Sheri even called Tara when all of this was going on, and she was so concerned about Chris and the threats and that he might be cheating and wanting a divorce, and Tara sat there and consoled her, all the while she was the one having an affair with her husband. It's unforgivable. And remember, when he got back, that's when Christmas came along and when he told Sheri he wanted to divorce. Well, she literally said, Chris, I'll never divorce you. I'm not going to leave. What are you going to do? Kill me? We know this because she told her friend that. So is that what happened? Had he killed her? Or was he merely guilty of breaking her heart and cheating? Then by January 2nd, right after this, they get another letter. And this one was in the mailbox, found by Chris, of course. Sheri was so scared. And remember her friend Jessica that came to stay with her? Well, she didn't just show her how to use a firearm. She showed her Tara. That's right. She opened up Facebook and she showed her a picture of Tara and said, you want to know who my husband is cheating with? This is her. So Sheri knew, or she thought she did. Maybe she had seen something. I mean, at this point, Chris was no longer even having sex with Sheri, except for a couple of times when Sheri told her friends that he practically forced himself upon her. Just like Chris Watts, Chris Coleman decided to go to sleep in the basement and was no longer sharing a bed with Sheri anymore. He would even send pictures to Tara of him not in bed with Sheri because Tara was jealous. Tara was jealous. But then every so often he would come and strip Sheri down, basically get on top of her and tell her, just lay there until I'm done. And don't get the wrong idea. I'm just horny. And that makes me so mad. Of course, Sheri isn't here to tell them any of this. The investigators are gathering all of this information from everybody's cell phones, from friends, and what Sheri had said to them. But I'm pretty sure that she's being honest. I don't think Sheri was going around making these things up. One of the reasons that Sheri didn't want Chris to go to the Super Bowl, remember that, was because the game was in Florida. And she knew he would probably go hang out with Tara. And to be honest, I couldn't find information about who he went with, but let's be real. I'm pretty sure he brought her. Sheri felt like that was exactly what was happening, so she wanted to prevent it as much as she could. And that's when she got desperate enough to do this next thing. Recall when she finally reached out to Joyce Meyer? Well, it wasn't just because she wanted Chris to stay home from work. I mean, sure, she believed Joyce was responsible for the reason why Chris was acting so distant all those months, but really, she wanted to kind of cut to the chase and tell Joyce that Chris was going to divorce her. That way, she would get Chris in some hot water and maybe he would change his mind. Chris was not happy about this at all. His boss pulled him aside, Joyce Meyer, and actually asked Chris what was going on. That's when Chris agreed to get some couples counseling. That was a recommendation from Joyce. She set him up with someone from their ministry to meet with him and Sheri. Now, how does that work? Because don't you think that someone from the ministry is going to report back and that's why Chris played nice? Makes sense, doesn't it? These aren't real counselors either. They don't have degrees in counseling. They're biblical teachers. They're people from the church. So I'm not sure there's any kind of confidentiality agreement. I'm pretty sure they could go back and tell Joyce what was going on. This was the time when Chris told Sheri he would do anything to save their marriage. And then he was off to Tampa. When Sheri sent him that nude picture of herself, remember that? Kind of like, look what you're missing at home. It didn't go as planned because Tara was there. She saw the picture and grabbed Chris's phone and texted Sheri back. She typed, "Honey, you really got to stop this. I'm not in love with you anymore." I can't even imagine receiving a text like that. I don't know what I would do. I actually do know what I would do. I would say, "So long, loser," because how dare your husband speak to you like that? How dare anyone speak to you like that? That's another thing. Chris actually had to get a BlackBerry. The one that he said he didn't have any numbers programmed in yet when investigators were asking him for Sheri's mom's contact information. Well, he got that BlackBerry because he wanted to stop using his work phone to contact Tara. And he loved his new BlackBerry because it was like his own private little world where no one could see anything he was doing. He tried to erase a lot of things too, but they were able to get them back. There was another thing that prompted him to do this. There was a woman that was friends with Sheri and also worked for Joyce Meyer. She was in charge of all the work cell phone bills, and she noticed that Chris's bill had gone up significantly. And when she looked at the number, it was coming from Florida, and she wondered who in the world could he be in contact with. So she let Daniel Meyer know, and he called the number, and a woman answered, and he hung up. He was like, what in the world? When he confronted Chris about this, he lied. He said, "Oh yeah, that's just the wife of one of my friends that's mutual friends with Sheri, and they're going through a rough patch in their marriage, and we're going through a rough patch in ours, so I'm just talking to the husband about our lives." This man lies like a rug, I'm telling you. When they dug through this BlackBerry, they found even more disturbing photos. There were all kinds of just really obscene things in there. I mean, even videos of Chris pleasuring himself in the tub. There was a video that he actually sent to Tara. It said, "I just finished texting you and I've still got a heart on. Want to see it?" Oh boy. And then he proceeds to focus the camera right on Mr. Willie and he's like, "I just want to see where this would go. I love you. See you soon." The thing that was confusing is during this whole time that he was talking to Tara and having this affair, he was still a really great dad. He was still doing so much for his boys, and he even was going to counseling and seemingly trying to work things out with Sheri. So was he really going to get that divorce? During the next 2 weeks of this investigation, they have a forensic investigator who's an expert in all things electronic, and they're going through everything. Chris's work laptop, his home laptop, all of the surveillance camera equipment that was in the basement. Well, they couldn't find any recordings because it looked like the system was broken. And they assumed, okay, that makes sense. The killer must have gone down here and broken everything and stolen the tapes. Once inside Chris's laptop, though, they found even more questionable things. When he got home from the conference in Tampa, he literally created a document on his computer called All About Tara. I kid you not. It was like a shrine to this woman, a virtual shrine. It had everything, like her eye color, her hair color, like he was going to forget that. When her birthday was, her dog's name, Gizmo, the dog's birthday, everything about her, her clothing size, bras, panties, jeans, everything. And I have to admit, I did something similar when I met John. Things like what was his favorite Starbucks drink so that I would know when I go to order it. But I mean, this man was obsessed. He had everything in there from what kind of perfume she liked, her favorite foods, flowers, everything, because he would be buying her gifts when they weren't together. So he had to have this list set up about everything she loved so he could get it right. Meanwhile, his poor wife is trying to reconcile the relationship, understand their differences. He's got this beautiful woman at home with 2 wonderful sons, and it still wasn't enough for him. And there were also some journal entries that he kept of what him and Tara were talking about, what they did together. And he said, on November 5th, 2008, that was the day that Tara changed my life. He also noted significant dates in their relationship, like the first time they had sex. Chris's computer even included monthly references to Tara's period and the date of their anniversary. Their anniversary! They even picked out a name for their future child. It would be a daughter named Zoe Lynn Coleman. Are you kidding me right now? I wish I was joking. And it wasn't long before they were making plans together, talking about where they would live, what their future was going to be like, even that Chris was going to reverse his vasectomy so that they could have children. It was just crazy talk, like teenagers that are head over heels for each other that aren't even making sense. It didn't make Chris look very good, but it also didn't prove he killed his family. However, from the beginning, the chief and Detective Barlow actually felt that Chris was their prime suspect hours before they were pressing him in this interview. It was when they were standing in Chris's yard assessing this entire situation. It was an instinct. Chris wasn't smarter than them, even though he thought he was. They began putting together all the suspicious things in regard to Chris, and here they are. I'm just going to do kind of like a list. First, Barlow noted that Chris said he was crossing that JB Bridge at 6:43 when he was phoning him frantically asking him to go check on his family, but Chris didn't get back until 6:56, confirmed by this video right here, the video that was from Barlow's own house. It caught Chris's car pulling into the driveway, and that just seemed way too long for someone that was that worried about their family. It's like he delayed it on purpose, maybe giving them some time to find what he left behind. Well, it turns out GPS phone records showed that Chris took the long way to get home, not the usual route. Then there was this. When the chaplain was praying with Chris in the ambulance, he noticed scratch marks on the inside portion of Chris's right forearm, and he also saw a big red spot that looked like it was going to be forming a bruise. Captain Jerry Paul was right outside of that ambulance, and he heard the chaplain asking Chris, "What happened to your arm?" Surprisingly, Chris doesn't say a word. He just kind of looks at his arms, and then he did the whole head on the hands, like in his lap, elbows on the thighs kind of thing. And then out of nowhere, that is when he went irate. He started banging on the gurney, almost like he was trying to make it look like that's how he got the scratch. Because later, Chris and his dad are sitting in the lobby at the police department. Ron saw the scratch. Just like the chaplain, he asked him, "What happened?" Chris said, "I don't know. I think I might have hit it against the gurney when I was punching it." Well, he was in earshot of the captain at the time when he said this, and the captain knew that wasn't true. At least two people, the captain and the chaplain, saw the scratches prior to that. And get this, when Chris got into that interrogation room, he all of a sudden told investigators that he was cold. So they gave him a towel. You can see it in the video.
How you doing? I mean, is there anything I can get? You're freezing?
Yeah.
This white towel across his lap. Well, they thought it was really odd that as soon as he got this towel, he placed it so it would cover up his right forearm. He didn't use it to cover his legs or his body, just his arm. I was like, wow, am I really seeing this? It's true. Not only that, since I'm on the topic of the interview or the interrogation, at one point the investigators left and they put their notepad on the table. And when they left, Chris literally starts flipping through it. And then he's breaking down, crying, covering his eyes again, rocking back and forth and looking at the scratches on his arm. And then he would just pick up his phone and text. Later, investigators found out he was texting Tara, saying that he was thinking of her and that the wake was at 3 p.m. tomorrow. In the same text that he's thinking of her, he's talking about his dead family's wake. Speaking of texting Tara, he was actually texting her when he was sitting on the curb with his dad. He was basically letting her know, "I'm all right, and I'll call you when I can." Tara was the first person that Chris called after his family was murdered. They found that in his call log. When he was still at the crime scene, he kept picking up his BlackBerry and looking at it mid-cry. And right as the Reverend was telling him in no uncertain terms that his family had been murdered, and Barlow thought that was very weird. He also thought it was weird that this man did not rush through them to go see his family. When they wouldn't let him inside, he did not try to get past them at all. He never asked how they died. He just wasn't responding the way people typically do in these circumstances. Another thing that didn't add up from the call logs is that Chris doesn't usually have the habit of calling his wife in the morning to get her up. That was unusual. They went back and looked. She took care of the kids on her own all the time. She wouldn't be relying on Chris to make sure she was up and getting the boys ready. Another thing Barlow noticed, and he was so good. He was so good. He's such a great detective. It seemed like Chris's tears were forced because they would stop midway down his face. He didn't have enough tears to cry. When something this horrific happens, you're usually unable to stop crying. and then he would conveniently put his head in his hands so that no one could see his face. Another thing that was odd was at one point Chris tells his dad that Sheri's best friend from childhood, Tara, needs to be contacted as soon as possible, and he gives his dad the number and says, "Call her now." Not Sheri's mom, not Sheri's brother, but Tara. In the interview, Chris even mentioned the upcoming trip to Disney World with the boys. This was proof that the marriage was on track. They were making plans as a family together. But what he didn't mention was that when he told Tara about this, she was irate. Because guess what? She was jealous and didn't want that to happen. So she went and took it upon herself to call Disney and cancel the trip. And when she got the refund, she used it to book a cruise to the Virgin Islands for her and Chris. They're both evil. Then there was that annual sleepover I told you about that the boys had, little Brandon and Gavin and Garrett. Well, Brandon and Vanessa assumed like every year for the past 5 years, the boys would spend the night together to celebrate their birthdays. But to her surprise, Gavin and Garrett came running over to tell Brandon they weren't allowed to spend the night that night. Chris said it was a bad night. Vanessa was so confused that she almost went over there to confront Chris about why he told the boys they weren't allowed to have a sleepover. She was going to let them spend the night at her house. But I wonder why it was a bad night. It's like it had to be done that day. Why? Well, there's a reason. Through the text messages, they found out that Tara had been pressuring Chris to divorce Sheri. And she even gave him a deadline to serve her with divorce papers, May 4th, 2009. And Chris agreed that he was in the process and told her he would. But he knew all along Sheri would never divorce him. She said it before. So despite being the one who wanted to leave, it didn't take Chris long to realize that if he divorced Sheri, she would most likely get alimony and child support, on top of the repercussions if Joyce found out that he was having an affair and that it was his fault that the marriage had not worked out. He quickly figured out that a divorce wasn't going to work for him. This was the guy who wanted to keep all of his money for himself and his new girlfriend. Because if he lost his job, things with Tara would probably not work out. He would no longer be able to provide her with all the lavish things that he was gifting her with. So Chris found a way to not only get rid of Sheri and the boys, but to ensure he never had to pay them a cent. It was the perfect clean break he needed to start his new life with Tara. And right after he started the affair with Tara, he set this plan in motion. Investigators got into Chris's work-issued laptop, and forensics showed that that Gmail account, Destroy Chris, was created on Chris's work laptop with his work login from his IP address. Here's the graphic. At 8:19 p.m. on November 14th, his work account created the Gmail account. And then from that Gmail account, the emails were sent, like this one titled Houston Death. Remember that one? And the same IP address sent the F you all email. This graphic shows how the IP address was connected to the internet on AT&T Wireless. And this IP address cannot be assigned to anyone else. And while they're going over many of Chris's other emails and documents that he had written and typed, guess what? Remember those misspellings? Well, they found out that Chris commonly misspelled those same words, opportunity and publicly. I kid you not. Yet in the interview, when one of the detectives asked him, so you're saying that some madman just sat in the shadows and watched for you to leave and then entered the house? Chris replied, that's the only thing I can assume. Well, Chris was the madman. Within days of the murder, there were numerous witness reports and stories from Sheri's friends who told an entirely different story about Chris, about the state of the marriage. Kathy claimed Sheri told her if anything were to happen to her, Chris did it. And there was no foreign DNA found in the home. And the security cameras at both the Coleman's home and those of their neighbors showed no strangers entering the house. There were no suspicious vehicles lurking around, only Chris, Sheri, and the two boys. It looked like the evidence was against Chris, and it was overwhelming. There was simply no evidence to indicate that anyone else had been in that home at the time the murders happened. On top of that, Chris had a motive. The words on the wall in that spray paint in the blood red color. A look at Chris's credit card transaction showed he purchased something at a place called Handyman True Value. Well, they were able to get a hold of that company and get a receipt. And guess what? It was for one item, just one, a can of apple red Rust-Oleum spray paint. And this transaction was back on February 9th. Dumb. though Chris was adamant that paint was purchased for him and his sons to paint bullseyes to practice paintball shooting. It was just at the home, and it was used by someone else. That's what Chris said. The problem is, handwriting samples willingly given by Chris matched the threats that were written on the walls of his home. There were a couple other things that really solidified to investigators that they had the right person. These investigators were relentless. They went scuba diving in that big lake behind the house. They were looking everywhere, and they retraced Chris's path according to his GPS. They started searching all over Interstate 255. And when they got to the area near the base of the Jefferson Barracks Bridge, they found something. And this was on the exact route that Chris would have taken to the gym. They found a noose. It was made out of like a twine cord-like material, which they ended up matching to hay bales that were in the Coleman's backyard. You can see them right in this picture. There's a twine that holds the hay together. And they found that the noose was made from the same twine. The autopsy had showed that all three, Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett, had been strangled with a cord-like ligature. And remember the surveillance cameras that Chris supposedly set up? He was bragging about them. Well, none of them were operational. And investigators ended up finding a broken faceplate to a digital video recorder in the westbound lane of Interstate 255 near the base of the bridge. Maybe that's why it took him 13 minutes to get home instead of 5. Detectives also became aware that Sheri's name had been taken off the house deed 7 months earlier. During those 2 weeks that the investigation was going on and they were building a case against Chris, there was a lot happening. There was a candlelight vigil held in the community. 300 people showed up, and they were all frightened for their lives. They were heartbroken for their community. Children were crying. They didn't understand how to deal with the fact that their little friends, who were only 3rd and 4th graders, were dead. And then, of course, there was Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin's funeral. It was a private funeral for only Chris and his parents to attend. And all donations and flowers and money were supposed to be sent to none other than Grace Church Ministries in Chester, Illinois? What? No, I couldn't believe this. Well, of course that didn't sit well with Sheri's family. They wanted to pay their condolences and see their family members again. So they asked Chris permission to please allow them to take the bodies to Chicago so that their family can have a funeral of their own. And at first he says yes. But a few days later, when Mario calls to make those arrangements, Chris could be heard talking to somebody in the background. Well, that somebody was his dad. Then all of a sudden, he said, "No, you can't take the bodies." Well, luckily, Sheri's family, they weren't having it. And her cousin was a lawyer. He went all the way to St. Louis, and he got a restraining order that stopped Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett from being buried. Sheri's family had to get a court order to finally allow them to transport them back to Chicago so her family could say goodbye. Can you even imagine? Her only daughter and her only grandchildren. I'm glad she was feisty and she fought for her right. Sheri's big Italian family gathered around, sharing memories, like the fact that Sheri was named after a Frankie Valli song, Sheri, about a guy trying to get a girl to come out and dance all night long. Sadly, Sheri's mom did have to send her daughter's body back along with her grandson's, where they were finally laid to rest in Chester at Evergreen Cemetery. By May 11th, Chris voluntarily came down to the police station to provide fingerprints. Investigators had said they needed to rule his out at the crime scene, and we all know that they were the only ones there. They only belonged to him and his family. Chris had said that he locked all the doors and windows that night. Remember that? Yet one was open, the one in the basement. And these investigators, they went above and beyond. They had that window tested forensically by an expert, and they found nothing wrong with it structurally, meaning it was not forced open. It was just left open, and the screen was pushed out. Only a few days later, on May 15th, after Joyce had been informed about Chris's affair, an internal investigation was done and Chris resigned. I guess he was given a choice to resign or be fired, and well, he bowed out. And all this time, he was being protected by his parents. But not for long, because on May 19th, Chris was arrested at his parents' home early in the morning for the first-degree murder of Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin. He was being held without bond. And of course, his parents were in shock, utter disbelief, as were many people who knew Chris, or thought they did. But his parents really didn't think their son was capable of something like this, and they stood by his side. For example, and this really disgusted me, when his dad was confronted with the fact that his son Chris was obviously having an affair with this woman, Tara, He literally tried to make an excuse for Chris, saying, quote, Tara was just meeting a need that Sheri at the time wasn't taking care of. He went on to add, quote, well, every man's got his desires and every man has to be respected. It's built into every man. If your wife doesn't respect you, you're going to find respect someplace else, end quote. Respect, Pastor, is that what we're calling it? Because Tara and Chris didn't look very respectful in the home video they took from his webcam in Hawaii. But Ron Coleman even said that at that moment, Sheri had stepped back from doing her job as a wife. So you know what a woman's job is in Mr. Coleman Sr.'s eyes. His son probably felt the same. His dad even texted him while he was in the interview and said, you should probably get an attorney. Indeed, he did. He got one before he was even arrested, which is fine. Anyone should, I guess. But Ron even said that Chris never intended to marry Tara. It was all Tara. She was possessive over Chris. She bought the promise rings. And that Chris was actually trying to break it off with Tara because things were getting better in his marriage counseling with Sheri. But I can't help but think about when that woman took his phone and texted Sheri when she sent that picture. Tara wasn't innocent in all of this, far from it. During one interview with detectives, they told her they even found a compromising photo of her on Ron's computer.
It's going through your phone
Okay.
and computer, and obviously we've done the same with Chris's and even his dad's. And
Right.
there happens to be a picture of you rather compromising on his father's computer.
Okay.
So
That's pretty interesting.
yeah.
I don't know anything about that.
I mean, there is some lack of evidence too that didn't quite make sense. There's the fact that pretty much everyone knows when you use spray paint, it blows back on you. It leaves little tiny droplets. It's almost impossible not to have that happen. Well, Chris didn't have even the tiniest bit of any bright red spray paint anywhere on his body or clothing. How? Well, a glove with red spray paint was found on the route that Chris would have taken to the gym. A gym he hardly visited at all. He only went there 3 times. It wasn't the one he usually worked out at. The first time was November 15th, the day after the first email threat came in. The next time was February the 3rd. And the third time was the morning of May 5th, when he found his family dead. On the night that the Destroy Chris email was created, Chris was texting Tara nonstop up until one period of time that night, the exact time that the Gmail account was made. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but it was when Dr. Michael Bodden, renowned forensic pathologist, was asked to analyze the autopsies. He determined that Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett were killed sometime between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. His conservative estimate was 3 a.m., probably earlier because of lividity and other biological processes that had already occurred. And that's when the state attorney's office felt that they had enough to convict Chris. In April 2011, 2 years after the murders, Chris's trial got underway. A number of witnesses were called for both the prosecution and the defense. Chris didn't testify in his own defense. He wanted to, but his attorneys advised against it. But he did admit to the affair. I mean, he had to. However, he pleaded not guilty to killing his family. Joyce Meyer was subpoenaed to testify, but she was going to be on an international trip on the date that the trial were to have happened. So they allowed her to come in beforehand and to record the testimony. They played this pre-recorded testimony from Joyce Meyer's at trial, and it was very telling. Her testimony helped the state's case by proving someone else didn't log on to Chris's computer to make those threats. Listen to what she said.
Did he have a company laptop computer?
Yes.
Did he carry it with him?
Yes.
Is this something that you saw with him when you made these trips, for example?
Yes.
He seemed to always have it with him?
Yeah, he carried his computer.
Okay. Did you ever see anybody else use that computer other than the defendant?
No.
Joyce also said that she was not aware that Chris was having an affair, but she did know about his marital problems with Sheri.
May 6th, 2009, this is the day after Sheri and her sons were murdered. Did you speak to the police that day?
Yes.
When you talked to the police on that day, the day after this incident, were you aware whether or not this defendant was having an affair?
I wasn't in the beginning of the interview, but I was informed toward the end of the interview that he had confessed to having an affair.
But as you came into it that day, you didn't know?
I did not know.
Were you aware of whether or not he was having marital problems, though, between him and Sheri?
I did know that he and Sheri were having some marital problems.
How did you know that?
Well, she had called our office and talked to...
I'm gonna object as it calls for hearsay unless she spoke directly with this witness.
Okay. Did you speak with Sheri Coleman?
No.
Okay. How were you aware that they were having marital problems?
She talked to my son, Daniel.
And did he relate that to you?
He told me so I could talk to Chris about it.
And did you in fact talk to the defendant about the situation?
I did.
And just generally, what was that conversation?
He said that, you know, that they were having issues, that Sheri had told Daniel that...
I'm going to object.
Okay.
Sheri Coleman told anybody.
Okay. Well, my son Daniel told me. Okay.
My son Daniel told her regarding the situation as well.
Although what the defendant told you, you could tell us. What was your conversation with the defendant about the problem?
What he told me is that he felt that Sheri was very controlling, that no matter what he did, she wasn't happy, and that they just in general, you know, were not getting along, and that he was just really tired of it. And at that point I asked him if, you know, they'd be willing to get some marriage counseling from a pastor that we have at our office, and right away he said yes, they were willing to do that, which they did do.
Do you know about when that was that he talked to you about that?
It was in the fall 2008. I asked him if they would get counseling with Mike, and he said yes.
Immediately said yes, is that right?
Yes.
And he followed through with that counseling?
Yes.
Mr. Shepard, what's his position? Is he employed by Joyce Meyer Ministry?
He's in our employment.
Is he a pastor? Or
He's a pastor. He functions as like a chaplain for our ministry, and does a lot of work within the departments, a lot of leadership teaching, a lot of different things like that. He helps oversee our church in the inner city.
Is he a licensed counselor or marriage counselor?
He's a licensed pastor.
Okay. Is that? Well, I don't think that answers my question, though. I mean, is he a licensed counselor or marriage counselor?
No.
Is that one of his normal parts of his job, is to engage in marriage counseling or other types of counseling?
Yes.
You sent Mr. Coleman to counseling because you believe that could benefit him in his marriage with Sheri Coleman, is that correct?
Yes.
And in fact, based on your observations, after they had gone to several counseling sessions, things had seemed to have gotten better between Chris and Sheri Coleman, is that correct?
It wasn't anything I observed, it was what I was told. He told me they were doing better, and the counselor, Mike Shepard, indicated that he felt they were doing better.
So was Mr. Shepard supposed to report back to you on how the counseling was progressing?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he did report back to you that things were going pretty well, is that right? And I think you testified before that, or earlier, that Sheri Coleman never contacted you directly about these marital problems, is that correct?
Yes.
When it came to the threats, here's what Joyce had to say.
Did you ever become aware of any threats that this defendant said he had received against himself or his family?
Yes, he told me about some.
The defendant personally told you that?
Yes.
What did he tell you? What threats did he report?
He told me that he had gotten an email threatening his family if he did not stop working for me. And then he told me that somebody started putting these threats in his mailbox, at which point I think he became more concerned about them, since that meant somebody knew where he lived. He told me that they had taken the information to the police, that he also had a detective that lived across the street from him, and that they were going to make arrangements to put a camera there on his mailbox to see if they could see who was actually doing it.
When do you think that was, when you became aware of the threats from him?
I think it was probably sometime late March or in April.
Of 2009 then? Yeah. This is spring, okay. To your knowledge, had any other employees ever been singled out in that way?
No.
Did you have other employees that provided security, as this defendant did?
One other one, yes.
And there wasn't any threats or anything to that person?
No.
She even asked to talk to the police on May 12th, before Chris was arrested, and here's why.
Okay, this was all from a conversation you had with police on May the 6th, but on May the 12th, did you again ask to talk to the police?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
About a month prior to the beginning of May, say during the month of April, I just felt like I was just noticing that he wasn't as attentive to his duties. He was forgetting things that were just not normally him, and just in general not quite as engaged. I noticed a personal cell phone in his car one day that was being charged up, and I asked him about that because I'd never seen him with it, because he had a ministry phone. That was what he carried all the time. He just said it was a personal cell phone, and I started asking another question, and then I just thought, you know, it's really none of my business if he has a personal cell phone, so I let that go. So.
Did he, during that period of time, ever call in sick for work?
On May the 4th, he called and told me that he wasn't feeling good and asked if he could take the day off.
May the 4th, 2009.
Right.
Was that unusual for the defendant?
Yes. I mean, he worked for us 11 years, so I can't swear that he never took a day off, but I didn't remember him ever calling me and saying that he didn't feel good and wanted to take off. He was just always there.
And how were you informed on May the 4th, 2009 that he wasn't coming to work that day?
He called me in the morning and asked me if he could take the day off.
Wow, he actually tried to call in sick the day before his family was killed. Like probably the night of when his family was killed if it happened at 11 p.m. Joyce was even a little suspicious when Chris asked to stay behind in Florida after the conference, and here's why.
Did the defendant go on a trip with you during that period of time to the state of Florida?
Yes.
Was there anything about that trip, again, something you observed directly of the defendant, that caused you now to be suspicious?
Well, he stayed there. He said he wanted to stay down there for a few days after our trip was over, after the working part of our trip was over. He said he was going to visit these friends, a girlfriend of Sheri's, after I found out that that was the girl that he'd been having the affair with. Made me kind of suspicious then as to why he stayed there.
And that was sometime during this period of time, late 2008, early 2009?
Yes, I think it was in 2009.
And was that unusual for him to stay after when you'd gone on that trip?
Yeah, and especially he was by himself, so.
Okay. And again, in retrospect, that made you wonder.
Yeah.
When asked what would have happened if Joyce found out that Chris was having an affair, here's what she responded with.
Now, I have to ask you, if the defendant were having an affair, if you had known that at the time, and I understand you've testified that you didn't, what effect would that have had on his employment?
If he would have been having an adulterous affair while he was still married, then it could have definitely affected his job.
Were there persons over the years that were terminated in situations like that?
We had situations where they were, yes.
And in fact, he was married during the period of time that he worked for you, married to Sheri Coleman, correct?
Yes.
Were there other persons who had adulterous affairs while married whose employment was terminated at Joyce Meyer Ministry?
Yes.
For that reason?
Yes.
And there was a policy against employees getting a divorce. Joyce admitted that. But she also said that it all depends on the circumstances, so listen to her now.
Now, I have to ask you about the distinction here. What if it was a divorce as opposed to an adulterous affair?
Each situation is handled totally separately based on the circumstances. We have many people that work for us that have been divorced. A person is not necessarily, do they lose their job because they get a divorce? It wouldn't have been the divorce so much as the immorality.
So, for instance, if a person in your employment, if their spouse filed for divorce against them, and perhaps they had little control over that, you might leave them in your employment? That's a possibility?
Certainly.
Okay, and on the other end of the spectrum, if a person was having an adulterous affair and then filed for divorce from their spouse to be with that person, then their employment may have been terminated.
May have been, yes.
Okay. Do you think there was any situations of that in the past where someone was actually terminated under those kind of circumstances?
I believe so.
Okay, at some point you did learn that the defendant was having an affair, is that correct?
Yes.
Was that from the police, or how did you actually find that out?
Well, the police initially said that he had confessed to the affair.
What effect did that have on his employment? And I don't know what happened at the end of his employment.
He resigned.
Okay. Did he discuss that with you?
No, that was handled through our COO.
Okay. Did you fire him? Did you
I didn't,
terminate
no.
his employment? Okay. So once that situation became common knowledge, the defendant resigned employment with Joyce Meyer Ministry?
He asked to resign, yes.
Okay. And you accepted his resignation?
Yes.
But Joyce also said that Chris was a great worker and that she didn't think anything suspicious until after the accusations and the evidence came out. But he also never tried to leave or to ask to spend more time with his family or his wife.
Mr. Coleman was an excellent employee during his 11 years at Joyce Meyer Ministry, isn't that correct?
Yes, he was.
And he started the security department from the ground up pretty much?
I believe so.
And you had no complaints of him as an employee at Joyce Meyer Ministry?
Nope.
And the things that you testified to about your suspicions only became your suspicions after Mr. Coleman was arrested and charged with these offenses, is that correct?
Yes.
Only after looking back, correct?
Yes.
They were not suspicious or unusual at the time of these events?
No, they were things that I felt were a little bit unusual, but because he'd worked for us so long and I had no reason to think otherwise, I just...
Mr. Coleman was working at the ministry. You were aware that he had looked into other job opportunities?
Yes.
And one of those opportunities included starting his own business, is that right?
Yes.
And at some point, did he ever, to your knowledge, did he ever make any attempts to leave the ministry's employment?
No.
Not to your knowledge?
No.
Did he ever express any concerns to you about spending more time with his wife or his family or taking more time off?
No.
What was your general attitude, would you say, as far as Mr. Coleman being able to take time off and spend with his family? I mean, obviously he had a pretty hectic travel schedule based on what you testified to earlier.
He did, but he also got sufficient comp time, and he was allowed to make his own schedule. I even encouraged him to take more time off than what he did. Suggested to him that he spend more time with Sheri during the weekdays when he was home.
But it was true that he was denied that time off for Sheri and his 10th anniversary, or someone did.
Are you aware of an instance in, I believe in May of 2008, when Mr. Coleman requested time off for August of that year to spend time with his family and celebrate his 10th wedding anniversary with Sheri Coleman, and he was turned down?
Yes.
And there was a out of overseas trip, I guess, scheduled in August?
An overseas trip, which were very important for us, and probably, as far as needing security, some of the most important ones.
Okay.
And so.
And Mr. Coleman requested to miss that trip and have one of the other security people go instead of him, is that correct?
I don't think there was another security person that could have went instead of him. He was pretty much it as far as that level of security, but we asked him if he could take the weekend before or the weekend after.
Okay, but he specifically requested to miss the trip, and the minute, or I don't know who,
He did not request it of me. He talked to me about it, told me that it was very important to Sheri. If I recall, the request was put in pretty late.
Okay, but he was denied that time off, right?
Not from me,
okay,
but
from the ministry, whoever.
Yeah, I guess.
Right.
If you say he was, then
right.
He was.
Well,
I mean, I didn't handle those things, so I don't really know.
Of the evidence presented was an actual replica of the Coleman home. Right here is a picture of it, with a recreation of the events and how the victims were found, where the spray paint was, etc. All of this was very important in this case, but out of all the testimony and evidence that the jury heard and saw, the most important was that of Tara Lynch herself, the mistress. And man, did she look like a celebrity walking the red carpet when she appeared at the courthouse. She shared the depth of the affair, including how Chris would take unflattering pictures of Sheri to prove that he didn't love her. And that's cold. She told the jury that he told her he hated Sheri. And those promise rings, they both had them. They were black rings that they would put on anytime they were together. And according to her, he constantly talked about looking forward to a time when his wife and children wouldn't be a problem anymore. Tara wore that ring on the stand when she testified. It takes 5 to 7 minutes to strangle someone. This is not a quick death. This is hard to do. And you have to sit in front of that person watching them taking their last breath. It's a very intimate crime. And if Chris did this, it means he had to do it 3 times, to his wife, then one of his sons, and then the other one. And then he had to go back and spend time writing all of those nasty things on the wall. After 2 days of deliberations and 2 years to the day since Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett were murdered, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty on all counts. He was spared the death penalty and sentenced to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The crowds were outside in the rain and celebrating the verdict, cheering and screaming in delight. And all of Chris's subsequent appeals have been denied. Sheri knew about Tara, whether Tara thought so or not. Sheri confided in Jessica Wade. She told her she knew Chris was having an affair. But when Sheri said, "I do," she meant it. Forever. She was loyal, compassionate, and forgiving. She was in this until death do us part. And it's just sad that she had to die at the hands of the man that she made that promise to. To this day, Ron and Connie Coleman believe that Chris is innocent. When asked why Connie was so certain that her son wasn't the killer, she said, "Because I would die for him," because she knows it's not within his character. Ron even chased some leads of his own, saying that there was someone who suggested that Sheri was trying to get this woman out of another country during her missionary work, and that woman's husband was the killer. Ron even supposedly told his congregation that if they thought Chris was guilty, they need to leave. When they visited or called Chris, they never mentioned Sheri. They hardly talked about their own grandsons. But they were worried that Chris wasn't getting enough to eat. Even at the trial, Chris's younger brother Brad was mouthing, "You're dead," to Detective Barlow. At a recess, Barlow confronted him. Of course, he denied it, but Barlow said he knows what he saw. The judge told Brad that he could be held in contempt of court if anything like that happened again. Ron and Connie had even suggested that it was Sheri on Chris's computer making all of those threats so that he would quit his job and spend more time with her. Ron even talked positively about Tara, unlike Sheri. He mentioned that Tara had been born again after everything happened and that she called to ask for Connie and Ron's forgiveness for the affair. These parents sat through countless autopsy pictures of poor Sheri, little Gavin and Garrett. But as soon as the video of Chris's interrogation went up and the detectives were pushing Chris to tell them that he did it, Connie and Ron walked out of the courthouse. Are you kidding me? I'm serious. Connie later said that she thought the detectives were being abusive to Chris and treating him like a little lamb being led to the slaughterhouse. I have no words. I did ask myself why Ron and Connie would actually believe that all the cops, the investigators, the attorneys were lying, because that's one of the things they said, that the reason that Chris is being convicted is because everyone is lying. And I think it might have something to do with believing so much so in their faith and their religion that they think, well, they're all non-believers, so they must speak with the devil's tongue. I think they truly, truly believe the things they preach, even if they're wrong, even if there's evidence to the contrary, because there is in this case. But Chris's parents taught him that he was one of the chosen ones. He was above others. He could do no wrong. And perhaps this is why it was so easy for Chris to decide to kill his family to serve his own needs. What do you think? Not only that, Chris was on top of Joyce's world, one where she preached, if you have enough belief in God and you're a good enough Christian, you will prosper. And it breeds eliteness mindsets, thinking that you're above others. Some ask if Chris was so good with technology and security, why do stupid things like use your own credit card to buy spray paint or not get rid of your electronics? And many say the same thing about Brian Koberger, by the way. But as I was reading a book called One Last Kiss about the Coleman family, the author suggested arrogance. The mindset of these individuals can shift into thinking that they are so above everyone else. Chris actually did interviews from prison where he tried to explain everything from him about to leave Tara and lying to her about serving his wife divorce papers, down to saying that he saw a hooded figure on his surveillance videos. He viewed them with Sheri, but he couldn't download the footage because he didn't have all the right equipment yet. This is the head of security for a $20 million company. He couldn't simply save an important video of the person that may want to kill his family. Oh, and he also went on to challenge Dr. Boden's science, saying, no. If you take the core temperature data, it actually comes out that they were killed at 5:47. So 2 minutes after he left at 5:45, someone came in and killed them. It just did not make any sense. However, a juror came forward later after the verdict and said that the first vote was 7-5 for not guilty when they were in deliberations. But nevertheless, the jury changed their mind because of the lies. They looked at the timestamps on pictures of Tara and Chris from Chris's cell phone, and Tara had testified that they did not become physical until December, which was a lie, and the photos proved that. Before we end, something to note that I thought was interesting was a wrongful death lawsuit was filed against Joyce Meyer Ministries by Sheri's family. However, the lawsuit was dismissed because the judge conceded that there was no way Joyce Meyer's ministry could have known that one of their employees would kill their family. I think in the event that it truly was someone else and that Joyce Meyer's ministry didn't take any steps to protect Chris's family, things would have been different, but that wasn't the case. In the wake of the murders, it was Sheri's friends and family who spoke out in the memory of her and her 2 sons. There were no kind words from Chris's parents, who couldn't think of a single nice thing to say about Sheri. They doubled down on their opinions of her as a terrible wife and a mother, and they repeated the negative views that they had from the very first time they had met her. But Sheri's friends and family spoke about her generosity and her kindness. They talked about her dedication to volunteering at local churches, where she would host trivia nights and fundraisers for those less fortunate than herself. Even when her marriage was at its worst, she bought gifts for Chris and told others what a great husband he was. Her 2 boys were the absolute joy of Sheri's life. She believed that the best way to parent them was to ensure that they had a childhood full of joy and exploration. Sheri was an affectionate mom who loved to laugh and cuddle and kiss her children and instill a sense of kindness towards others in them. Sadly, Sheri's mom sent her a Mother's Day card, but it arrived after Sheri was already dead. To this day, Chris denies being responsible for the murder of his wife and children. There's nothing more for me to say. I've showed you everything I found on this case, a case that has haunted me for so long and that I've wanted to do for a while. I'm so sorry. So sorry to these precious, innocent little boys and a wife that was trying to do the best for her family. It was just never enough for Chris. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye.